Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. Today, let's dive into a truly heartbreaking case together. 29-year-old Ben Rennick had it all. Money, fame, a career that he loved, and an adorable family. But one tragic afternoon, he was found dead in his workplace, surrounded by snakes. No one knew the dark secrets that were about to be uncovered, but what was obvious was that this was a cold-blooded killing. So buckle up as I tell you about Benjamin Blue Britt Rennick, a world-famous snake breeder who sadly passed away in 2017. But first I need to take you all the way back to 1950, when Ben's father was born. Frank James Rennick was raised in Rolla, Missouri, a southern city with a population of about 12,000 people. Frank's grandparents and parents were all in the pet food manufacturing industry, and Frank grew up wanting to follow in his family's footsteps and become a successful businessman. When he was in his 20s, he moved out of the house and got married to a woman named Nancy. He was determined to establish himself on his own. But in your 20s, it can be quite a roller coaster. Frank's career was going great, but his marriage wasn't, and soon they separated. Frank was running Bow Wow Dog Food Company, a pet food manufacturing company, and that's when he met Charlene Marie Keenans. Charlene actually went by Kim with friends, and she was 2 years younger than Frank. She loved animals, kids, traveling, getting drinks with friends, and doing some interior decorating. Kim and Frank ended up getting married on August 18th, 1980, in Las Vegas, and I bet that was a blast. They returned to Missouri and started planning a family together. Frank eventually sold his company, Bow Wow Dog Food, to ConAgra. With that money, he was able to move out to the country, start a new business, and provide for his growing family. The Rennicks moved to a small town 2 hours north with a population of only 700 people, New Florence in Montgomery County, Missouri. It's about an hour and 15-minute drive from the center of St. Louis, and it's so small that it doesn't even have a hospital. This area is known for its farming, wine and spirit tasting, and families living on huge plots of farmland, staying there for generations. Frank and Kim lived in a large farmhouse on a 72-acre property that bordered the Danville Conservation Area. Kim gave birth to their first son, Samuel Bryant Kimish Rennick, in the mid-80s. He was outgoing, fun-loving, a little bit brash, and the most adorable mix of Kim and Frank. Not too long after, Kim was pregnant again, this time with baby Ben. Benjamin Blue Britt Rennick was welcomed into the world on August 4th. Benjamin Blue Britt Rennick was welcomed into the world on August 4th, 1987, in a St. Louis hospital. He was a quiet kid, growing up on the farm, surrounded by nature. The first few years of Ben's life were magical. He and Sam had daily adventures around the property, playing hide-and-seek, finding buried treasure, fishing in the pond, and collecting insects. Even then, as just a 4-year-old, Ben loved animals. He liked lizards and turtles, and he loved snakes. Ben was begging his family for a pet snake, and Kim told him that when he was old enough and a little more responsible, they would take him to the pet store, and he could pick out any animal he wanted. I mean, they lived on a farm, but it wasn't paradise forever, because in September of 1992, tragedy struck the family, the first of a long series of unfortunate events. While the Rennicks were visiting friends in St. Louis, a huge, and I mean huge, gas explosion occurred in their farmhouse. The gas plugs had been removed from a gas line, causing it to malfunction. I don't know anything about gas plugs or why they would have been removed, but what I do know is that their house was completely gone. Random debris and insulation were raining down on New Florence for over an hour after the explosion. Luckily, none of them were hurt. Poor Ben, who had just turned 5, lost all of his favorite toys in the house he'd grown up in. But the Rennicks were resilient people. Frank had plenty of money from Bow Wow, and he and Kim were able to rebuild the farmhouse, bigger and better than ever. That's the way to persevere in the midst of complete calamity, and I commend anyone who can pick themselves up and try again. The new house was 10,000 square feet. It was decked out, it had a pool with a diving board, and Frank and Kim worked hard for everything they had. They were very happy to spoil their kids with whatever new toys and games they wanted. But they were human, and they had their vices. Both Frank and Kim suffered from alcoholism, and their drinking got worse after the stress of rebuilding the new home. It's tough managing addiction, And Ben decided from a very early age that he didn't want to be anything like his parents. He preferred to keep to himself. He didn't drink, didn't go to parties or do drugs, and he was fine with that. It suited him. He had seen that side of life and wanted nothing to do with it. In 1993, Kim started having health issues, and sadly, she was diagnosed with cancer at only 41 years old. Kim was determined to fight the disease, and even in moments when Frank was overwhelmed, Kim was his rock. She was devoted to their children and wanted to be there for every single milestone. One of those milestones came when Ben proved he was responsible enough to take care of a pet. Kim and Frank took him to the local pet store, and can you guess what he picked out? A yellow rat snake. Ben was one of those people who was obsessed. If you got him talking about snakes, he wouldn't shut up about them. He collected snakes all through elementary and middle school, keeping them in small stacking drawers that he cleaned weekly. By the time he reached high school, Ben was purchasing ball pythons, reticulated pythons, Burmese pythons, and even anacondas. Ball pythons were his absolute favorite. They were small, docile, and beautiful to him. Snake collecting is actually a very intense hobby, and Ben's parents weren't sure if it was going to go anywhere, but he sure was spending a lot of money on snakes. Sam definitely didn't understand his brother's obsession. He wasn't interested and didn't want to touch them, but he had to admit that his brother was pretty cool. While Ben's hobby was taking off, Frank opened a new pet food company in 1996 called Spectrum Pet Care. Other associations, including SPS Brands and Consolidated Food Group, were all under the umbrella of Spectrum. Frank was the CEO. Spectrum made organic pet food and treats, and it was very successful, even in its early years. It had a lot of investors, which was a good thing because Frank had to pay for Kim's medical bills and help out with their elderly parents. In 2002, Ben's grandma sadly passed away, and this was another difficult time for the Rennicks. That same year, Ben was a freshman at Montgomery County R2 High School. Ben was artistic and nerdy. He got into heavy metal bands, learned to play the drums, and even played drums in his high school band for a while. On weekends, Ben took care of all his snakes. Sometimes he would do yard work for a man named Michael Scarlett, a handyman who lived about half a mile away. Ben was the only kid in the neighborhood who ever offered to help Michael, and Michael described Ben as very hardworking and friendly. By the time Ben graduated high school in 2006, he decided to turn his collection of snakes into a snake breeding business called Rennick Reptiles. He bred his first clutch of ball pythons in 2007. Now this process is called pairing, and it's where Ben would put one female snake with one male snake to produce what they call a clutch. A clutch had between 6 and 15 eggs which would sit in an incubator, and that's how you get baby pythons. Then, Ben would sell these snakes online. At 21 years old, he had 20 clutches per season, so he was selling hundreds of snakes. In the reptile world, pairing pythons is really tricky. You have to understand genetics and how different snakes will produce different patterns. Ben focused on getting the coolest colors and mutations possible. In 2010, he created an entirely white and purple ball python, the first in the world. This snake was named the Rennick Ghost. He was a pioneer. And that part one can get on board with because I love science, especially how genetics work. After this, Ben left New Florence for a little while, came back and started building his snake facility on that 72-acre property. As for the rest of his family, Kim's health was taking a turn for the worse. She had been battling cancer for nearly 15 years. Frank had been doing everything he could to get investors to invest in his company. He promised that Spectrum Food was the next big thing. It was going to be sold at 7-Eleven, and then came Mars and Walmart in 2006, 2007, and 2008. He sold hundreds of bonds, but that's when the financial crisis hit. Frank struggled to meet manufacturing demands and pay all of his employees. His son Sam, Ben's older brother, had been working at Spectrum as the plant manager, marketing director, and sales manager, so he was feeling a lot of pressure. He was clearly wearing a lot of hats, but he could tell his dad was really stressed. He also noticed that his dad wasn't managing the books correctly. Then in December of 2008, 56-year-old Kim tragically passed away in their home, surrounded by her boys. But before she passed, She looked her son Sam in the eye and told him that she wanted this house and this land that they lived on to stay in their family for generations to come. This was her dying wish, that Ben and Sam's kids one day would grow up on this land and continue the Rennick legacy. Kim's death left a hole in the family, and nothing would be the same again. Ben threw himself into his hobbies. He had a steady girlfriend at the time, played in a heavy metal band, and liked to go to the movie theater. I told you he was a big collector of snakes, but he was also a big collector of other things. He collected famous props from his favorite horror movies. His snake collection was getting bigger and bigger, and he was becoming very well known in the reptile community. The reptile community is very tight-knit. If you're immersed in this community, you know everyone, and everyone knew Ben. He'd go to all the conventions, and he even had his own YouTube channel called Rennick Reptiles, the same name as his company. He did a bunch of videos about his snakes. He was breeding 2,000 ball pythons a season, and Ben's clients would buy dozens of snakes from him because they trusted him to keep the snakes healthy and clean. He was a rising star. One of Ben's friends in the industry, his name is Dave Kaufman, called it a living art. Instead of a painter having a canvas, the snakes were all these colors on a palette that would come together to create something new. Ben was truly gifted. He was an artist in his field. On his YouTube channel, he gave a couple of tours of his facility. It was organized, clean, and perfect. You could tell just how much time he put into it, how professional he was, and how serious he was about his business and his community. He even did interviews on other channels, like Dave Kaufman's channel, where he talked about how he got into pairing and his love for snakes. He didn't do this for the money. He did it because it was truly his passion. He was passionate about this craft. In May of 2011, Ben's successful career was overshadowed by a huge scandal. His father was sued, and he faced 20 years in prison for fraud. Remember Spectrum, the very promising pet food brand? Well, it turned out it had become a Ponzi scheme. Frank was in over his head. Essentially, what this meant was that Frank would promise these investors that their funds would be returned to them and that their investment would produce a profit. But what he was doing was using this money for his personal gain, and when it ran out, he had to pay back investors. So he'd recruit even more investors to pay back the original investors. As each level of this scheme increased, it became more complicated and harder to maintain. Frank was in way over his head. In 2010, he had taken $7 million of investors' money and used it to pay 250 existing investors he had at the time. He would tell investors that their money was going to equipment, food production, and manufacturing, but he was using it to pay back his debt, and that is not okay. Eventually, this all came to light, and the news was everywhere. Between 2006 and 2008, Frank had used the investors' funds for his own purchases. He paid for a lot of medical care at St. John's Hospital for Kim and a dermatology office. This was most likely also to help Kim battle her cancer. He also paid for satellite TV, cars from Ford Motors, Carnival Cruise Line, and he even paid $70,000 to his son Ben for Rennick Reptiles. Last but not least, all those bonds I told you about that he sold to investors weren't even registered in the state of Missouri. So Frank had been in survival mode for years, and Spectrum imploded. A lot of people lost their jobs. I don't know why he did this. I know he must have been very desperate, but he was responsible. He made a very bad decision, and he couldn't turn it around. Tragically, on Father's Day in 2011, Ben found his 62-year-old dad lifeless in their home. Frank had a gun near his hand and a gunshot wound to his torso. When Ben found him, it was too late. Frank was already dead. Ben was in shock. It was Father's Day. This was his dad. Ben ran and got Sam, and together they called the police. When everything came out in the news, it was devastating for Sam and Ben. Sam lost his job too. Their dad had been suffering in silence for so long, trying to keep the company afloat, and now all of these other people were suffering as well. So now, as adults, Sam and Ben didn't spend as much time together like they did when they were kids, but they had to come together and figure all of this out. They did have some things in common. They both loved customer service, and they both loved working very hard. But that's pretty much where their similarities ended. Sam had a big personality. He liked to go out, drink, and party. Ben, on the other hand, preferred to stay inside with his snakes, and Sam thought his brother was no fun. The only thing they did together was go fishing. According to Frank's will, all of his money and his life insurance actually went to Sam, while Ben got all of the farmland. Frank and Kim had verbally expressed to Sam that he also had rightful ownership over the land, so they agreed that Sam and his wife, Alexandria, could move into the farmhouse. Ben was already building up his reptile facility. It was a one-story ranch house on the property, and he started building his own small house next to it. Sam got a new job, and Ben went through a very tough breakup. He toured around with his metal band for a while, and at one of those shows, he reconnected with an old friend, Linley Joe Gallatin. They hit it off. They had already met back in high school when they were teenagers, but now they were both single and older, and they felt an instant connection. Soon, they became more than friends. Linley was born on March 14, 1998. She grew up in a tiny Missouri town called Wellsville with her sister, April. Her dad, Linley, was an electrician, and her mom, Brenda, was a nurse. Linley inherited her love for animals, kids, and helping people from her parents. When she graduated in 2006, she got her massage therapy license through Metro Business College in Jefferson City, which is a town close to New Florence. When Linley and Ben first met, she was actually dating a guy named Josh H. They had a child together named Matthew, but before she gave birth, Josh went on vacation to the Ozarks. He was driving under the influence and crashed into another car. He got 10 years in prison. A very pregnant Linley, with her new massage therapy degree, was now a newly single mom. Linley got a job at Riversong Spa. Massage therapy was definitely her calling. She was very passionate, loving, soft-spoken, and bubbly. Making friends came very naturally to her, and Linley's 4-year-old Matthew was the light of her life. She wanted to marry a guy who loved her son as much as she did. Well, that's where Ben Rennick comes in. When they met, they immediately felt that connection and fell head over heels for one another. Where Linley was extroverted, Ben was introverted. Linley was a dreamer, and Ben was a doer. They say that sometimes opposites attract, but when it came to their interests, everything matched up. Linley loved animals, and she was fascinated by Ben's snakes. Both of them were dedicated to great customer service. Linley loved taking care of her clients, and Ben loved making friends at his reptile shows. They both loved music and movies. They went to the movie theater for a date night at least once a month. They both loved kids. Ben adored Maddie and treated him like he was his own son. Within a year, Linley moved in with Ben and announced on Facebook that she was pregnant with a baby girl. Sam was thrilled for his brother. He had never seen Ben have so much fun and be so happy as he was with Linley. Ben's entire world seemed to grow bigger when Linley was around. She pushed him to get out and enjoy life, and in turn, Ben was a great partner. He took care of himself, lifted weights regularly, and had a tattoo sleeve featuring Godzilla and the Ghostbusters, which I thought was really cool. He was organized and meticulous, and he was very generous with his time. If Linley or any of their friends needed anything, he was happy to lend a hand. It was no question that Ben's number one love was his kids, not his snakes or his drums. His kids came first. Their daughter Amelia, nicknamed Emma, was born in 2012. That first year with a new baby is always a big adjustment, so Ben outgrew his band and moved on from that. Now he had kids of his own, just like his brother, and Sam and Ben would take their kids fishing on the weekends together. Ben and Linley ended up getting married in St. Charles, Missouri, on April 13, 2014. It was a small outdoor ceremony. It was very beautiful, and Linley changed her last name to Rennick. She quit her job at Riversong Spa, and by 2015, Linley and Ben were running Rennick Reptiles together full-time. When you walked into Rennick Reptiles, you entered a long hallway with stacks and stacks of plastic shelving along the walls. To the left was the office, and down the hallway to the right was a half wall turning into another alcove with tons of shelves. All of these shelves held snakes. The staircase downstairs led to incubators and larger snakes, including Ben's prized 600-pound albino anaconda. Ben kept up to 3,000 snakes at any time, and when he wasn't spending his time overnight express shipping snakes all over the world, or pairing snakes and doing inventory, he was cleaning. Monday through Friday, he would clean 200 snake pens a day. Wednesdays were feeding day, and they'd put a rat in every drawer. Ben and Linley were the most ethical, motivated, and humble snake breeders in the industry. Reptile conventions were like fraternity meetings. Everyone knew one another, and Ben was respected for his professionalism, artistry, cleanliness, and most of all, his fair business practices. At reptile conventions, he mentored up-and-coming businessmen, hung out with friends like David Levinson and Dave Kaufman, and Linley also had her own friends at these conventions. Everyone got along so well and truly respected both Ben and Linley. But at the end of the day, Rennick Reptiles was Ben's dream, and soon Linley wanted something to call her own as well. Linley wanted to get back into massage therapy and also work closer to her dad, Lyndall, who lived in Columbia, Missouri. She started working as a massage therapy instructor at Columbia Career College and began talking to Ben about her ideal career. Linley had dreamed for years of opening her own massage practice, and with Ben's financial help, she opened Essentia Spa in 2016, focusing on stress relief, wellness services, and beauty treatments. Essentia was part of a red brick commercial building in Columbia in the Cherry Hill Shopping Plaza. This spa was about a 45-minute drive from their home in New Florence. Columbia, Missouri was much more built up than New Florence, where Ben and Linley's home was. This area was very different. Where they lived was very rural and secluded, especially being on 72 acres of land. But now Linley had something of her own, and she was able to be more social. Unlike Ben, she definitely thrived being around other people, so she ended up hiring 15 new employees ranging from massage therapists to estheticians. While Essentia was her new project, she knew that she wasn't great with numbers, so she ended up hiring her best friend from Riversong Spa, Ashley Shaw, to be the manager. Ashley had an assertive personality and was experienced doing business in California. She spent her time at the bank and at the front desk, where Linley usually left her phone when she was with clients, so Ashley was just managing everything. Linley spent her days at the spa, dropping off and picking up kids from school, while Ben was slowly downsizing Rennick Reptiles. In February 2017, Ben's friend David connected him with a man named Robin Leoner, who was a goalie in the National Hockey League. Robin wanted to purchase all of Ben's python collection, which Ben evaluated at $1.9 million. That's a lot of money, especially for someone in a small town in Missouri. Ben's kids, Maddie and Emma, would be set, and of course, the Rennicks were really living the American dream. Robin and Ben discussed the deal, and Robin's final offer was $1.2 million for the collection. Ben agreed, even though they had a dispute during the deal. They couldn't figure out how much would be paid over what time frame and when Robin would be able to physically pick up the snakes. They settled on 6 installment payments every 3 months until Robin possessed all the pythons. At least that was the plan. Ben got his first installment payment of $200,000 in February 2017. He was finally cashing out on all of his assets and the work he put into this company. Now he had money to buy new snakes for an even bigger project he had in mind. Of course, Linley still had her spa, they still had the kids, but Ben was going to be a millionaire by the next year, and he felt invincible. If only he were invincible, then I wouldn't be telling you this story. So, let's fast forward to Thursday, June 8th, 2017. It was a hot, clear summer day. There were barely any clouds in the sky. Linley was driving home from the spa when the school called her. They told her that Ben had not picked up the kids, and that was concerning because he would never forget about them. Linley quickly swung over to the school, picked up Maddie and Emma, and then texted the babysitter that she would be about 15 minutes late. She and Ben had plans that night to go see Wonder Woman for their monthly date night. But when Linley turned onto the 72-acre property around 6 p.m., she had a very bad feeling. She told her kids to wait in the car and went into the reptile building alone, calling out for Ben. He wasn't in his office, so she walked down the hall, turned to the right, and that's when she saw a body lying face down in a large pool of blood. Linley screamed. She thought it had to be Ben. Who else would be in his reptile facility in the middle of the afternoon, apart from maybe Sam? But Sam didn't like snakes, and the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. So, hysterical, Linley picked up the phone and called Sam. He had no idea what she was saying. It was gibberish. When he got over there, the kids were outside the vehicle, watching their mother in a state of panic. Matthew, who was 9, looked at Sam and said, "Is my daddy dead?" These kids were completely confused, and Linley couldn't even form a sentence. Sam didn't know what to think or what happened. He went inside Rennick Reptiles, but he couldn't find Ben. He had to go back outside and ask Linley what was going on. At this point, she had called 911. She was crying, hyperventilating, and told the dispatcher that she found her husband on the ground, and there was blood everywhere. Then Linley took Sam inside. Ben was lying on his stomach. His head was facing the very southern wall of the facility. On the 911 call, you can hear Sam say, "Oh my God, my brother's dead." And now he was the one panicking, surrounded on all sides by thousands of snakes. Sam bent down to the ground and rolled his brother onto his back, because maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that it wasn't Ben. Maybe it was an intruder and Ben got away, maybe. But no, it was his brother Ben. His face was horribly bruised, his skull looked like it was crushed. Sam thought it had to be a snake. He even told the 911 operator, it was almost like it was to be expected, with Ben handling these creatures, that one day a tragedy like this would happen. Linley told the dispatcher that there was a snake on the loose, and Sam had a bad feeling it was Ben's 600-pound anaconda. The two of them went back outside. It was just complete chaos. I've never researched a case like this before. There was so much going on. Did a snake do this? Was that even possible? Well, that was the question. Anacondas do and can bite, even though they're not venomous. It would definitely hurt to be bitten. Anacondas kill their prey by constricting it, squeezing it until it stops moving and then swallowing them whole, no matter the size, because their jaws actually stretch. But clearly, Ben was not swallowed by a snake. From the looks of his head, Sam assumed the snake had at least made its way around and done this damage. I looked online and found an 800-pound anaconda. Ben's was only 600 pounds, but the one I found was 33 feet long. You can just imagine how massive this is. Although I don't know exactly how big Ben was, you can imagine it's not too far off in size. I heard that the longest one he had was 12 feet. That's still pretty big. When Sam came out of the facility, he was covered in his brother's blood, and Maddie and Emma looked at him in horror. Sam took him by the hands and walked them to the big farmhouse where his own kids were. Sam had actually been in the middle of interviewing a new babysitter and had left the babysitter and the mom with his kids while he went to check on Linley. Now, he was coming back with the other kids. This was one of the hardest conversations that Sam ever had to have, trying to explain to his kids and his niece and nephew that they were never going to see or talk to their dad again. Sam left the kids in the main house and went back to Ben's corner of the property where the EMTs had just arrived. Dee, an EMT, asked Sam to please show her where the body was, and inside he was laying face up. Sam said, "I rolled Ben over." Dee had owned snakes before, and she knew that snakes were usually harmless, but the officers en route were already terrified. Knowing where they were headed, they knew who Ben was. They knew what he did for a living, and the thought of being surrounded by snakes freaked them out. Especially getting a call that there could be one loose that just killed someone. When Dee went inside to do her initial assessment, she found that Ben Rennick had been dead for at least a few hours. Rigor mortis had already been setting in. She wasn't sure if the damage done to his skull was caused by a snake or not. It actually didn't seem likely. However, she did notice what appeared to be bite marks on his arm. Disturbed by just how much blood was everywhere, Dee covered Ben with a white sheet and went back outside to tell Linley, who was still hysterical, that her husband had passed away. Linley let out another scream and asked how she and her children were going to survive without Ben. She also cried out that a snake could not have done this. Was she in denial because of her own love for the creatures? Then the Missouri Highway Patrol and Sheriff's Department showed up, along with the coroner Dave Colbert and Deputy Harley Alt. They were terrified. I want you to imagine a bunch of grown men holding shotguns and yelling that if they see a snake, they're gonna shoot it without a second thought. Linley told them that a snake did not do this. She was repeating this. Ben was a professional. He knew how to handle these snakes. What were the odds that an accident like this could have happened? But we also have to keep in mind that not everyone has been in the presence of a snake, let alone big snakes, so it is a justifiable fear. I heard one officer on the body cam footage I watched literally tell the other officers, when they're going in, there could be a snake on the loose, so watch your asses. I don't want to make light of this, but even the EMT explained that you would see a snake coming. It's not like a snake is going to slither super fast and wrap itself around you. You're going to have enough time to run away. But these people did not have experience with this, so you can't blame them. First, the officers made sure Ben's body was clear of snakes. They asked Sam what he had seen when he arrived, and that's when he said, well, Linley had gotten there before he did. He didn't know what Ben's initial condition was like. When he arrived, he found his brother lying face down in the southern area of the building and had to turn him over to see what happened. Coroner Colbert crouched down to inspect the body. Ben's head was very close to a snake rack on the south wall. Within 15 seconds of getting eye level with the bottom rack, Colbert noticed a glint of gold on that shelf. It was a shell casing from a bullet. That's when he knew this was not a snake attack. There was probably not even a snake on the loose. This was a homicide, and the sheer amount of blood on the floor meant that Ben had not been shot just once, but multiple times. Coroner Colbert told Deputy Al, and they started scouring the scene for more shell casings, trying to find out how many bullets had been shot and where they were from. From what the officials could tell, Ben had been shot several times in his back, and it appeared from the casings it was a .40 caliber because these were Winchester SA bullets. Ben was probably caught off guard and fell to the floor. But that's where things got weird. When they were able to move his body, they found 2 divots in the ground that looked like they had been struck by small projectiles, as well as 1 divot near one of his hands. However, the bullets weren't on the floor, not even fragments. They looked at the floor in other parts of the building, but these were the only 3 divots they found. Also, Ben had a large head wound that had been caused by a gunshot at close range. Sam had wrongly thought that his head had been squeezed so powerfully that it cracked like this, and that the death was caused by strangulation. So had the perpetrator shot Ben from a distance at first into his back and then, as he fell, walked over to him and shot him in the head just to make sure he wasn't alive? That's what it appeared had happened from the divots, but it was hard to tell. It seemed as though whoever shot Ben knew what they were doing because they had only missed once, and the bullet had gone through one of the snake pens about 40 inches off the ground, breaking through a few plastic containers and landing in a container with a snake. Officers tested blood drops on the scene as well, and Ben kept this place as clean as possible, but there were some other areas that could have either been dirt or dried blood. One droplet was dried blood, but it didn't look like it belonged to the actual crime scene. Maybe a puncture wound happened at another time with a snake, but of course, more information would be found after the autopsy. There were 20 professionals at the crime scene, with several of them wearing body cameras. When Sam learned that his brother's death was a homicide, he actually started making some really weird comments under his breath. Things like, Ben was cheap, he didn't lock the doors of his snake facility, he should have hired someone, so he had more help. I saw the door to this place, and I do have to say, it looked like one of those ordinary doors. Ordinary locks you could actually lock from the inside and use a key to open from the outside. Nothing fancy, no cameras, no security system. Sam thought, if only Ben had help, maybe someone would have been there to save him. Sam also started talking about Ben's financial situation. Things like if he had so much money, why was he so frugal? Sam was clearly upset. This was his last surviving family member, and it seemed as though he was in shock and just throwing ideas around. But then he said, "That's right, I'm the brother murderer. I understand being defensive if you've been accused of a crime, but nobody was accusing him of anything." Deputy Al thought that was very strange. Why would he say that? The next step in this investigation was into Ben's closest family, Linley and Sam. Linley had found Ben before anyone else, which automatically made her a suspect. and Sam touched his brother's body and may have had a motive since he was going around the crime scene criticizing his now-deceased brother, so he was also a suspect. Corporal Devin Faust was assigned to the case and arrived around 8:30 p.m. with a few goals in mind: tour the facility, interview the family, and figure out as much as he could about Ben's life. He was shocked when he saw Ben's snake facility and realized how big it was. He had heard of Rennick reptiles, but he didn't know there were thousands of snakes being housed there. He took Linley and Sam back to the station and learned that one of Ben's friends, David Levinson, I remember him. I did talk to you about him before. He used to go to conventions, the one who introduced Ben to the hockey player. Well, he lived just a few hours away and could help out by searching the crime scene because he could handle the snakes. So they called him in. Meanwhile, Sam told Fa that Ben was in the middle of a business deal with this professional hockey player, and when he spoke to David Levinson, Levinson explained to the detective that Ben had just sold 2 of his snakes not too long ago for $85,000. That was shocking. Not many people are aware how valuable these animals are. That made Detective Fa think this could have been a robbery. So back at the Montgomery County Sheriff's Station, Corporal Faust was interviewing Linley. She sat down in her Essentia Spa uniform and had processed the situation enough to be coherent and have a conversation. They asked her what she had been up to that day. Linley said she was working at the spa, and the last time she had been in communication with Ben, she texted him around 3:45 p.m. Linley told him that she had a headache and wasn't feeling well and needed to go lie down. Ben asked if she needed him to pick up the kids, and she said yes, so he agreed. But when she finally took off from work and headed home, the school called her and said that no one picked up Maddie and Emma. Linley told the detective she was really worried. She said she called Ben several times, but the phone just rang. This wasn't like him, not to answer his phone. She then explained that when she got to the facility, she just had a bad feeling. He had never forgotten about the kids or not answered like this, so before she went in, she made the kids stay in the car, and that's when she found Ben's body. Then Faust asked her if she had any questions for them, and she just muttered, "What happened?" He told her, "We don't know yet," and then she said, "What do I do?" This woman looked completely lost. Faust told her to lean on her friends and family during this challenging time she was going to be facing. Then he asked her if they could collect fingerprints, DNA, and do a gunshot residue test. Linley was fully cooperative, and he asked her if she knew anyone who would be upset with Ben to the point that they would kill him, and she said no. But then Faust asked if there were any family issues, and Linley kind of laughed uncomfortably and said, "Between Sam and Ben, yeah." This was news to Faust. He hadn't heard Sam's comments at the crime scene. Linley told him that Sam and Ben had gotten into an argument about the 72-acre property where they lived. She explained that Ben had inherited Frank's property, and Sam had inherited Frank's money. But Sam was the jealous type. The property was worth a lot more, and the big farmhouse was so old it was now falling apart. It needed $50,000 in renovations that Sam did not have the money for, so Sam was going to have to leave his home. Instead of leaving, he came to Ben and asked if he could just have half of the land, and Ben was like, "No, I'm not just going to give you half of the property." Ben was in the process of selling off his assets. He wasn't going to give up land for free. But he had a plan. He was going to sell the property, but Sam was mad that it was their mother's land. So he asked Ben if he could pay him for the entire property to keep it in the family. But Ben knew Sam didn't have that kind of money. So they kept fighting. They could not come to an agreement. At one point, it was very contentious. Linley said she tried to smooth things over, so she sent Sam a text telling him how much that hurt Ben. She then got a text from Sam's wife that basically just said, "Fuck you." So things were not good. Linley said Sam and Ben never got along as adults. Sam was overly dramatic, in your face, and she called his personality depressing. Whatever she had seen between the two of them, it wasn't good. Corporal Faust had plans to ask Sam all about this. Linley went home to her kids, and now it was early in the morning on the 9th. Next was Sam's interview. He wasn't told that Linley had given him a pretty bad review. They started by asking him about his day. Sam said he got to work, picked up his 2 kids from school, and returned to the big farmhouse where he lived with his wife. He was meeting with a potential babysitter when Linley called him. Then Corporal Faust asked if Linley would be capable of murder, and Sam was like, "No, we love Linley." When they asked if Ben had anyone else in his life that might be capable, Sam couldn't believe that anyone would kill his brother. Ben was such a nice, genuine guy. Sam thought there is no way the person who shot him knew him personally. Then Sam talked about his relationship with his brother. He said he loved him but that they did not always get along. He held some resentment over Ben's career because all he could talk about was his reptiles, and he was pretty arrogant. He liked to brag that he was at the top of his field, had all this money. Sam hated to talk about money because he was struggling financially. He didn't like to hear his brother bragging all the time, and Ben didn't like to go out or drink or hang out, so he wasn't very fun in Sam's opinion. But this didn't seem like the whole story. It seemed like Sam was jealous, like Linley said. But Sam adamantly refused that he would ever kill his brother. He had another theory. Sam told Faust the story of their father, Frank, and how he committed fraud. He said Frank's decisions caused a lot of people to hit rock bottom. They were angry. Sam and Ben had never had issues with Frank's old employees or investors, but there was a chance that someone wanted revenge. They knew how successful Ben was, and maybe they resented that Ben's reptile business was so successful that this could have been a robbery gone wrong. Plus, Sam told Faust that Rennick reptiles had been robbed before. A few years before this, someone had broken in and stolen $6,000 from the office, but Ben just brushed it off. He could sell a couple of snakes and make that money back in no time. When Corporal Faust asked who owned the land, Sam confirmed Linley's story that he got the money and Ben got the land. Sam was considering leaving the big farmhouse. He was spending more than he was making, and he couldn't afford $50,000 in repairs. However, Sam said that he and Ben came up with a plan, a verbal compromise. Their parents had told Ben and Sam verbally that the will was a bunch of legal jargon, and in the ideal scenario they would split the land evenly. So Ben and Sam came up with an outline of which half of the land was whose. Sam said they had never gotten into a heated argument, and he never demanded half of the property. However, Sam did sound bitter. He constantly denied, though, that he had anything to do with this tragedy. It was so early in the morning at this point, he was exhausted. He offered whatever he could do to help the investigation. When they asked for his fingerprints, his DNA, and a gunshot residue test, he agreed to everything. He even gave them full access to all of his apps on his cell phone, including Facebook. But they noticed Sam was sweating through his shirt halfway through the interview. He took it off and then offered it to the police. But why would he be sweating through his shirt? Did he have something to hide? Was he just nervous? Was this just a lot for someone to take? Sam did offer to take a polygraph. He promised to make himself available for whatever the detectives needed. It didn't seem likely that he would be so open if he were the killer. Honestly, you just never know. After Sam's interview, Corporal Faust went back to the snake facility to get a bunch of pictures of the entire crime scene. David was finally there, and he gave Faust somewhat of a tour. He helped him look through all the snake pens to see if anything was missing. He explained Ben's career and how important Ben was to the reptile community. David also told the story again about how Ben was going to sell his entire ball python collection to Robin Leonard. When Corporal Faust asked how much the collection was worth, David thought maybe $400,000 or $500,000 at most. But David said no. The ball pythons were worth over $1 million, and some of these snakes were worth a lot on their own. Based on the number of bullets and shell casings that were collected, Ben had sustained 5 gunshots. It's not quite overkill, but a calculated, cold-blooded murder. What would be the motive? It seemed clear that someone had to have wanted Ben's money. But when police went through the office and all the snake drawers, there was nothing missing. Investigators couldn't find any DNA or foreign fingerprints on the scene, apart from those who lived and worked there, like Ben and Linley. They also thought it was unlikely someone had come back to take revenge for Frank's actions 5 years before that, and it was even less likely that this was a robbery. It was more likely that Ben knew this person and that they had a grudge of some kind against him. Maybe it was someone in competition with him. By the morning, the gunshot residue results came back for both Sam and Linley, and they were both negative. But that didn't mean they were exonerated. Gunshot residue can be removed by washing and scrubbing the body, so either of them could have potentially done it and then taken a shower. Sam had a clear motive. He didn't want his family's land to be sold, and he had a rough alibi. It wasn't exactly solid, while Linley's alibi seemed more solid. But spouses are always suspects because of how close they are to the victim. When Faust interviewed people in the community, a few were very straightforward and said Sam did it. Others insisted that the brothers were very close since they lived right near each other and had always been together on that property. Others knew that the brothers had very different personalities. The day after Ben's murder, Sam decided to hang up a sign on the road leading up to his house that said, "I'm drunk and I'm armed." Well then, enough said, right? But armed meant Sam had a gun. Some people took this as a threat. I like to play devil's advocate. Sam was still processing Ben's death. He didn't want company. Maybe he had no clue that he was even a suspect at this point. He could have thought he was just being questioned as a witness. In the next couple of weeks, he worked through the anger, the guilt, and the resentment that came with grief. After that, he had nothing but good things to say about his brother. That's convenient now that he's gone. Corporal Faust talked to Ben's neighbors, Michael Scarlett and Babette Tucker. Babette had known the ranks since before Ben was even born, and she said she did not think Sam or Linley could even hurt a fly. Michael Scarlett, who lived half a mile away, told Faust that on the afternoon of June 8th, he heard a woman screaming. After everything was said and done, and everyone knew what was happening, Faust figured that this was Linley finding Ben's body. He interviewed Ben and Linley's babysitter, Catherine, who had been taking care of the children every week for years. She had received a text that night saying Linley was running late and that her services wouldn't be needed that night, so this was a dead end. Faust kept his options open. He hadn't talked to Robin, the hockey player, yet, but if he ran out of ideas, that option was still in his back pocket. Meanwhile, Linley was struggling. The week after Ben died, she actually moved into her father's home in Columbia, Missouri, with the kids, where she was trying to rebuild their life piece by piece. David was also grieving his friend's death, and he agreed to stay in the area and take care of all of Ben's snakes for free. The entire reptile community was shaken up, and Ben's friend Dave Kaufman started planning a fundraiser for Ben's family. This fundraiser was held on Wednesday, June 14th. It was a huge online auction of all of Ben's snakes. The bidding price of a small ball python started at $5, and people paid up to $6,000 for the snakes. They were able to raise over $40,000 for Linley and the kids in Ben's name. Ben's funeral ceremony was held a week after that. When Sam arrived, Linley wasn't there yet, and that's when he was told he could not go inside the funeral home until Linley arrived. That was weird to him. Sam wanted to see his brother's cremated remains, but Linley did not want anyone alone with Ben's ashes. It's understandable. You're worried, you're scared. This is something so tragic. But some people wondered why she thought Sam was the killer and was being protective. Maybe she hadn't forgotten Sam's comments at the crime scene, or maybe she just didn't like him. At the end of the ceremony, the family let balloons fly into the air, and that's when little Maddie broke down in tears. He was screaming, "Why, Mommy? Why?" And Ben's daughter, Emma, she didn't know what was happening. These poor kids were traumatized. They did not know who would do this to their daddy and why. Ben's autopsy results revealed that he had been shot 8 times. Once again, one bullet had missed his body and hit the snake pen. The other 8 entrance wounds were in the back, neck, and shoulder area. He had been shot 5 times in quick succession in the back, meaning he probably didn't know what was happening to him and fell to the floor before he could process the pain. One of these bullets was lodged in his right shoulder area. Another one had gone through his right elbow and didn't exit, but created an exit wound on the outside. Then the perpetrator approached him and fired one shot through the back of his head and one shot through the left side of his jaw, which exited through the right. These shots hit the floor, creating those divots, but the bullets stayed inside his skin, which was why investigators had not been able to find them in their initial investigation. The divot near his hand was still a bit of a mystery, though, probably made by a shell hitting the ground, since there was no gunshot residue on his body from these 2 entrance wounds. These 2 shots had to have been fired at least 18 to 20 inches above Ben's body. I'm not great with math or distances, but I wasn't sure what 18 to 20 inches above the ground would have meant. You'd have to account for how long the muzzle of this gun was, how long the person's arm was, plus how the gun was pointed. It's common sense that usually when you shoot a gun, your arm is fully extended, but it doesn't have to be. So, all I'm trying to get to is they were trying to figure out how far the person was and how tall the person was, but it was really hard to determine someone's height according to the way a bullet struck someone. But trajectory can be figured out. I'm sure you've seen Dexter before. It's the same concept. They put those pieces of red string out, calculate the distance where the bullet came from, and sometimes exactly where the muzzle was and how far away. The last shot Ben sustained was a contact wound. Someone had actually placed the muzzle directly against Ben's temple and fired, creating a lot of pressure that caused significant injury to his brain and brain stem. It was an injury that nobody could have survived, and that last shot caused a visible wound, like blowing out part of his skull. But this is why his brother thought it was actually squeezed, and this was causing a lot of significant bruising to his face as well. Officers had not been able to find all 8 shell casings, meaning that someone had tried to pick up some of the casings, but they weren't able to find a few, including one that was under Ben's underarm. They were able to retrieve 4 intact bullets and 1 shattered bullet from Ben's body. As for the puncture wounds on his arm, they appeared to have been a snake bite at first, and a random drop of blood away from the crime scene seemed to be related, but it turns out they weren't. They don't know how they got there. The Missouri State Highway Patrol Troop F and the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department continued to work on this case, as well as the St. Louis Dispatch, which had more officers available. They looked further into Ben's finances, because when it came to money, they had to figure out who would benefit financially from his death the most. Ben did not have a will, and it wasn't clear who would inherit all of his assets. Since his father, Frank, had passed away, he left the land and assets in a trust fund with a trustee. If Ben died without selling the assets, they would be passed on to the next generation of Rennicks, which were Ben's children. Ben's life insurance package, a whopping $1 million through Minnesota Life, wasn't clear whether there was a trust fund or not. Detectives were very confused, and it turns out Linley was also confused. When police called Minnesota Life, they found out that Linley had also called. That's normal for a beneficiary. They have a duty to figure out all of the funeral and other expenses related to the death. Linley was gathering the same information about whether the $1 million was part of a trust going to the kids, who were the secondary beneficiaries. I'm sure you know that a beneficiary is the person next in line to receive the money. If it wasn't a trust fund, and Linley was the primary beneficiary, she wanted to understand the process for being able to access these funds. She asked the company if she could be appointed what's called the next friend of Emma, so that she would have some control over where the money went. I know this could come off as shady, but police knew she was a business owner. She had to pay for funeral and business expenses, and she was having a rough time. She wasn't answering phone calls from people in New Florence, and was spending most of her time with her dad and the kids. Bobette, the neighbor, described Linley's behavior as fading away, and nobody could blame her. But we always have to look at things in different ways. Was it shady that she had called the insurance company the day after Ben passed away? That could seem pretty fast, but this was also an unexpected death. There's a lot to do in a short amount of time. Even if the money was hers to claim, she wouldn't get all of it until she was cleared of suspicion. That's just standard procedure when dealing with a murder. So Corporal Faust needed to know more. He called her in for another interview on June 19th, 11 days after Ben was killed. Linley sat down again with Corporal Faust. He asked for permission to download the contents of Linley's phone, and she agreed. Unfortunately, this download didn't work, so apparently some phones just don't download well. Faust had to look through everything manually. He examined her call log, her Facebook Messenger, and texts from the day of June 8th, and he found a bunch of messages between Ben and Linley. Totally normal. They were a married couple. They discussed their day. Ben asked Linley if she was mad at him because her texts were shorter than usual. She said at 10:49 and 12:40 that she had a massive headache. But back at 11 o'clock, between those two texts, he had sent Linley some financial details because he talked with his financial advisor, and he complained about the deal with that guy Robin. At 2:27, Linley actually sent Ben some risque nude photos. Ben was appreciative. They talked about her headache again, and if she needed him to pick up the kids, and she said yes, so he agreed. But while all this was happening, Linley was also texting a person by the name of Michael H. in her phone. She told Michael over text that she was exhausted, and that's when he offered something that the detectives did not expect. Drugs. But not Tylenol or Advil. No, he offered her some meth. Then they had no less than 6 calls over the course of the day, all about 2 or 3 minutes long. Of course, Faust asked Linley, "Who's Michael H?" And she said, "Oh, that's Michael Humphrey. His mom used to come in for regular massages." Then F asked why they had called 5 times and were texting on the day of June 8th but hadn't texted her since. Linley clarified her story. She said Michael had reached out for a massage but he was having car trouble, and she wanted to make sure he could still come in for his appointment. But she wasn't going to mention the meth. Maybe it wasn't as important as who Michael was. Then Corporal Faust asked about the spa. How was business? Linley admitted that she was having a little trouble making ends meet, but it was nothing that she and her manager, Ashley, couldn't handle. Faust then asked her about her relationship with Ben. He wanted to know if she had been unfaithful, if she had been talking or having a relationship with someone else at the time of Ben's death. Surprisingly, while I was watching this interview, I was even like, "What? Are you serious?" She said yes. She was honest, I'll give her that, but she said she had been hooking up with a man named Eric Bremer who worked for a local radio station doing some marketing and advertising for the spa. He and Linley started seeing each other about once a month to go over the performance of her campaigns, and over time they began having sex on a regular basis. They were hooking up maybe once or twice a month in her massage rooms, and Ben had even met Eric a few times, but he had no idea that she was having an affair. However, Linley insisted the affair was purely physical. She said if you asked Eric, he would agree it was just sex. It was nothing more. So Faust left the interview with some new leads. Eric Bremer, who may have a motive because of the affair, this guy Michael Humphrey, who had gotten a massage on June 8th and asked Linley if she wanted drugs, and then Ashley Shaw, who was the manager of Essentia Spa. She would definitely have more information about the financial situation. It was easy to track down Eric. He said that Linley was one of the nicest people he had ever met. Eric was also married, but he was looking for an escape in an unhealthy relationship, according to him. So that's why he had an affair. He said that Linley and he started hooking up, and they still were. But of course, after what happened to Ben, Linley was so upset that she grew very distant. He did say he was not planning on ending the affair, but he knew nothing about Ben's murder. After a full investigation, Eric was ruled out as a suspect. However, it was much harder to track down Michael Humphrey. They tried to track him down based on a previous address, but he no longer lived there. On July 17th, they found him and looked through his phone. There was nothing out of the ordinary with his messages to Linley on June 8th, but he did have a new message from her. It was a thumbs-up emoji from June 19th, the day that police had interviewed Linley about her affair with Eric. Was this a coincidence or something else? After the thumbs up, Michael texted back, asking how Linley was doing because he hadn't heard from her in a while. Linley said the thumbs up emoji was a mistake. She said Emma was playing with her phone and accidentally sent him that message. But considering they hadn't talked to each other in 2 weeks, it was interesting how her baby, her little girl, was able to send that message. Because if you know iPhones or phones at all, it's not like Linley's messages to Michael would have been pinned at the top. If you've been messaging other people, especially if 2 weeks have gone by, her conversation would have been way down at the bottom. But that wasn't enough evidence to mean that Michael was involved in anything either. So the investigators went to talk to Ashley. This was Linley's best friend and the manager of the spa, as well as the rest of the spa employees, including a woman named Rachel Hunt. Now, Rachel didn't know anything about the murder. Ashley also denied knowing anything, but she was Linley's closest friend. Ashley told Faust, "I'm sure you know that Linley was having an affair. Well, a couple of affairs." Faust nodded and was playing along. He wanted to know more because he didn't know there was more than one. Ashley said that Linley had actually gone on dating apps since that summer, and she had met a guy named Brandon Blackwell recently, like in the last month or two before Ben passed away. Last Ashley knew, Brandon and Linley were still seeing each other. They were together. So of course, Corporal Faust had been keeping an eye out for any suspicious activity on the snake farm. He had the perfect spy in the form of David. David had only seen Linley twice, and one time she was with another guy. Linley introduced this guy as Brandon, whom she called an old friend. But he's not. He's from a dating app. However, David didn't know that, so he thought the guy was nice, and that was that. But David did notice they seemed closer than friends. You could just tell, especially because they seemed like they could not take their eyes off one another. So, Corporal Faust already knew about Brandon from David, but now he had Brandon's last name and more of the story. He tracked down Brandon Blackwell in mid-August of 2017, and this man was head over heels for Linley. She could do that to a man. Brandon and Linley had been romantically involved for nearly 4 months, and Brandon claimed that they had this really special connection. I've heard that before. Call it what you want, but it's sad that Ben had this going on behind his back while he was alive. During this interview, Brandon denied being involved in Ben's murder. He said that Linley was not either. She had nothing to do with it. So now the police had nothing. Even if they got fingerprints and DNA from everyone, it would have been no use. What they really needed was someone to confess that they knew something about this crime, something that other people didn't know. It was a waiting game. Sure, there were a lot of things wrong with lying to your partner and seeing other people behind their back, but they needed more. David, who had stayed and worked with the snakes, was there for over a year. This guy was a really good friend. He was cleaning out the snake pens one day when he found another shell casing, so he sent it to the police, who sent it to the crime lab. But it didn't lead to anything. They already had the shell casings. So now they turned back to the finances. You may be wondering what was happening with the Essentia Spa. Well, the police had gotten a warrant to look through the contents of Ben's phone, and what they found were conversations about Linley's finances. She had every financial problem you could name. Linley had messaged Ben asking for money to cover several different lawsuits. So when she said it was manageable, I don't know what she was talking about. She was being sued by Capital One. She hadn't paid a couple of contractors, totaling maybe $10,000. She also wasn't able to pay her rent. Linley had been losing money for a long time, but she did not tell Ben, and in May, he found out. He was upset, rightfully so. It seemed Linley was good at hiding things, her affairs, her money problems. Could she be hiding something else? Ben said in a series of texts, "We are already paying $4,000 a month to keep your doors open. It's basically already covering your rent and loan. I mean, literally, it would cost us more money for you to close and for the lawyers to come after us for all those things. We owe almost $200,000 in debt on the spa. I'm really not sure what to do about it. I honestly don't know. Even if I file bankruptcy, the bank could put liens against us personally." After Ben's dad's business had imploded years before, it made sense that Ben would be upset. But now I wonder, was Ben selling his assets so that he could help his wife get out of all this debt? Ben then sent a text on the day of his murder that said, "No more lying. No more keeping things from me. No more not paying people and thinking it's okay to pay later." This text was on his phone, but when Faust had looked through Linley's phone on June 19th, he didn't see that text, which meant she had erased it. What was she hiding? And if Ben was accusing her of lying, did he know that she was also being unfaithful? That now seems kind of sketchy. But then again, sometimes in some cases, I've seen people who delete anything negative, anything they were texting or anything like that, between someone who just died. because they don't want to remember the bad times, only the good times. So who knows? But they also do this sometimes because they don't want to give authorities the impression that there were any issues between them. Investigators thought Linley's financial problems gave her a motive for murder, but there was not enough evidence to arrest her. In the meantime, she was still trying to get herself out of debt. Linley was not able to sign up as what I told you was called a next friend to her kids, so she was not able to claim the life insurance. In August, after Ben's murder, Linley made the executive decision to sell her spa. She didn't own Ben's assets, but suddenly the Rennick family property was being sold on the market. It didn't matter whether she got the life insurance money or not. The 72 acres of land were worth over $800,000. Sam, who was still a suspect at the time, was at his house when someone came knocking on his door and said that he had 30 days to leave his own home. That was his property. Sam thought back to his mom's dying wish that her grandkids would live on that land, and now Sam had 30 days to move his stuff into a storage unit and find somewhere else to live with his wife. He also had to find a place to move all of Ben's things. Why? This made him feel so betrayed by Linley. Sam did not understand why she was selling the property that he was living on. And that just blows my mind because it's family. I mean, I understand that a wife is family too, but on top of the $800,000, Linley had gotten that $40,000, remember, from the reptile community, the fundraiser, and now she got to sell all of Ben's snakes. She got into a legal situation with Robin, the man who was supposed to owe Ben $1 million for the ball pythons. Well, because the snake farm was part of the trust going to the kids, this became very legally confusing. No one was sure whether Linley could even sell the snakes to Robin anymore, so all of this had to be put on hold during the investigation. And because of that, I know you're not going to believe this, but Robin's hockey fan base started breaking into the building and taking snakes. Since Robin had paid that $200,000 installment plan to Ben and Robin hadn't received all of the ball pythons, he figured he was entitled to them. It was just absolute chaos. Because of the break-ins, the snakes got around the facility. They started breeding with different bins. It was a mess. Linley all of a sudden wanted to get rid of the snakes, and she did this behind David's back. She actually contacted one of her friends that she had met in the reptile world, a woman named Megan, and she offered to sell Megan the anaconda. Well, Megan was better friends with David, so she called David and said, "Linley's trying to sell me the snakes." David was shocked. He said, "Pretend to go through with the deal and see what happens." Megan was just stringing Linley along, and then she backed out. That's when Linley got really upset with David for interrupting the deal, and she even sent him a text threatening legal action. But if you asked Linley and her dad about all this, and Corporal Faust did, he questioned her and visited her regularly, she denied that she had a role in selling Ben's assets. She didn't have control over the trust, which means she didn't have control over the snakes or the property. The person in charge of selling the farm was a trustee, a legal representative assigned to her children as their next friend. So that's who was doing all this. Linley wanted to move forward, and that meant stepping back and letting hard financial decisions be made by a state representative, even if it made her look bad. So there was more to it. She wasn't actually in charge of doing that. 4 months later, after Ben's murder in August, Corporal Faust was doing a little research on Michael Humphrey. Do you remember his name? He found out that Michael was actually Linley's ex-boyfriend, which was interesting. Was there still something between them that would maybe give him a motive? It still bothered Faust that Linley had been texting Michael on the 8th and then on the 19th of June. So he looked further into Michael's life. Michael had worked a lot of odd jobs, including selling some stereo equipment and painkillers. He and Linley were together in 2010 before they had broken up. Then Michael went to jail for drug possession charges. He'd been using and selling painkillers and meth, and had a history of harming animals, specifically torturing cats. He had gotten out of jail in mid-May, just weeks before Ben was killed. So why had Linley gotten in contact with him again? I think she initially said his mom was coming in for massages. She never said it was her ex. Well, Faust sat down with Linley in another interview. I know this has been a lot of interviews, but Little progress, but this time she took a polygraph test. The usual questions: did you shoot Ben? Do you feel guilty about his death? She answered no, no, no. At the end he asked Linley how she thought she did on the polygraph, and she said, "I think I did well." The truth is, she thought wrong. Her polygraph was a complete failure according to the results, which I mention in every video are not conclusive anyway, because polygraphs are not reliable, but it said she had been deceptive again and again. When they told Linley, she just burst into tears and said she didn't know why she failed, but she did not kill her husband. The officers told Linley the circumstantial evidence against her was mind-boggling, and she stood up and said, "I have to go pick up my kids," and they let her go. You know, a polygraph test is not concrete evidence, and no witnesses had confirmed that she left the spa on the 8th at any other time. I'm not sure what other circumstantial evidence they had, maybe besides her financial problems, her cheating, and her text messages. But her phone records showed that she was at the spa the entire time Ben would have been home and killed. Even if she was the primary suspect, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office had no proof to convict her. In the meanwhile, Linley actually made an announcement in December on Facebook. She and her boyfriend Brandon were expecting a baby. People were shocked. Ben, who lived next door, loved Linley. He loved talking to her regularly, even after Ben's death. But there was just something suspicious about her. He contacted the police and reported that Linley was moving on a little too fast in his opinion. The police already knew all about Brandon. This was exactly what she did with Ben, so it shouldn't have been that much of a surprise. Remember, she met Ben not long after her previous relationship ended, and she got pregnant. It doesn't necessarily mean anything sinister, especially since they were having an affair. At this point, she was single, considering her husband was deceased. Even though it looked bad doing this so soon afterward, people grieve in a number of ways. Linley had her baby, and the police continued to look through all the messages between Linley and Ben, as well as Michael, but the case went cold for 2.5 years. Corporal Faust then had a family emergency and was no longer able to work on the case, so it was taken over by State Trooper Nathaniel Schaefer. He didn't have much experience with murder investigations, so Trooper Schaefer looked through all the evidence. Based on Linley's poor performance on the polygraph, he focused on her and ruled Sam out as a suspect. From his point of view, it seemed pretty obvious that Linley had been accusing Sam of getting in fights with Ben over the land, then sold the land. Why would Linley accuse Sam unless she was trying to redirect the investigation and shift the blame from herself to someone else? This was his theory. He felt like she was the common denominator in everything and had a lot to gain from Ben's death, way more than Sam did. The reptile community continued to speculate about what happened to Ben. Was his wife involved? Had she hired a hitman? Was it revenge? A failed robbery? It could be anything. Sam still didn't think Linley had anything to do with this. He called the highway patrol every other week for updates, but there never were any. Sam was scared that even though he didn't live on the 72-acre property anymore, whoever hurt Ben could still be out there, and they could hurt him. Or worse, they could hurt the kids. He thought it was weird that Linley didn't want to bring the kids over to hang out with their family or their cousins anymore. He didn't understand why she didn't like him, and he still had not gotten access to his brother's ashes. Trooper Schaefer told Sam that Linley was actually their #1 suspect. Sam was up in arms. He said, "No, I disagree. We might not get along, but she is harmless. You've seen her picture. I've been putting it up on the screen. But I have to say, everything that glitters is not gold." Even with happy posts about having a baby, Linley's new relationship was not going well. Linley's dad, Lion, noticed Brandon had a temper. He was a big guy, and once even threatened to kick Linley's dad's ass. They started becoming scared of Brandon. Linley reported him because he had gotten physical with her, and he was arrested but released because there wasn't enough evidence to hold him. Then Linley hired an attorney and filed an order of protection against Brandon, saying that he was a threat to her, her children, and her family. Brandon violated the order 12 times. This man texted her over 150 times a day and stalked her wherever she went. One time, his mother even called Linley and warned her to leave her house because Brandon was on his way there. Brandon had actually told his mother he was on the way to Linley to go sleep in her driveway. I mean, this guy was controlling. He was manipulative. If he couldn't have her, nobody could. Finally, he went to jail for felony stalking and for violating the protection order. But then in January of 2020, police got a call from a man named Mr. Blackwell. This was Brandon's dad. And he said Brandon wanted to talk to him about Ben Rennick's murder. Officer Schaefer pulled up to the jail, met with Brandon, and said he was there because Brandon used to date Linley. Brandon said yeah, and he wanted to confess the entire story of their relationship and Ben's murder. Brandon said he and Linley met online on a dating site in April of 2017, and they fell in love. They had a baby together, but then Linley accused him of threatening her, which he said he had never done. She broke up with him and got a restraining order, but Brandon wanted to see his kid. It was okay if they weren't living together and weren't together, but Linley wasn't letting him see his child and was accusing him of all this stuff that he said he never did. He claimed he never stalked her and he didn't violate the order 12 times. But I'm thinking, wouldn't they have proof of that? Not according to him. Not even once did he do anything out of line. She just wanted him in jail. Somehow, this man made a deal with Officer Schaefer. If he would tell the story of Ben's murder, he could get out of jail. They were desperate for answers, and Brandon was the closest they had gotten to any kind of insight. Remember, I told you that in order to solve this case, they knew someone would have to confess to something that they knew that nobody else did. When they asked him where his information was going to come from, his literal words were, "They're going to come straight from the horse's mouth," meaning Linley had told him everything he was about to share with the officer. Brandon said Linley had sat him down while they were vacationing in a cabin. He had told her if they were going to be together, he needed to know everything, the full truth of what happened with Ben, if she knew anything. For some reason, he said Linley agreed. She was paranoid and wanted to get something off her chest. But she also wanted to make sure their phones were in separate rooms to avoid being recorded by the government or the police. Then he said she dropped a major bombshell. According to Brandon, she told him she killed Ben. I was not expecting that, but remember, this is Brandon's version. He wants to get out of jail, so detectives have to keep that in mind and also have an open mind. Brandon said Linley's spa had been going downhill for months, and she asked Ben for money. But $44,000 wasn't enough to pay back all of her debt. So she had actually been secretly withdrawing money from Rennick Reptiles without Ben's permission. Well, Ben wasn't stupid. He figured it out. She knew that he knew, so Ben finally put his foot down and texted Linley, accusing her of siphoning money out of his business. Linley got scared. Brandon said she thought Ben was not only going to leave her, but take everything, including the kids. I mean, wouldn't anyone leave you after you're cheating and stealing from them, especially since Ben was actually trying to help his wife? Brandon said Linley knew Ben had the money to win any legal scenario, so she began getting scared, thinking that he would take the kids away and abandon her with all of her debt. Brandon said Linley decided a divorce wouldn't be enough, so she started to plot Ben's murder. He claimed that Linley went to her co-worker and good friend Ashley and told her everything. Linley told her the easiest ways to kill Ben would either be poison or a gun, neither of which Ashley or Linley had access to, but they figured the poison would be easier to get since Ashley knew how to get narcotics. Ben and Linley regularly drank protein shakes in the mornings and evenings, and they would always get a bunch of these for free from representatives who came into the spa. So, in midday, Linley crushed up narcotics that she got from Ashley and put them in a protein shake for Ben. Incredibly, he did not die, but he got super sick. He was vomiting over and over again and couldn't get out of bed. Somehow, he survived through the night and had no clue that he had been poisoned. He thought it was a bad shake or just some food poisoning. Brandon explained that Linley was still scared that Ben was going to run off with the kids, so she thought about people who might have a gun. That's when she remembered her ex-boyfriend, Michael Humphrey. He was fresh out of jail, a meth dealer. So what did she do? She recruited him. He started coming in for what she referred to as regular massages, but this was actually a meeting to plan the murder. On June 8th, Michael came to the spa and picked Linley up in his truck. He brought his gun and a pair of gloves, and they left for New Florence, leaving both of their phones at the spa with Ashley. So it would appear as though they hadn't left the location. Ashley was in charge of texting people for the next 2 hours to create an alibi for both of them. That's actually really clever, since most people do get caught due to their reliance on their phones. But we don't know if any of this is true. Brandon said before Michael and Linley skipped town, Michael realized he was out of gas. Linley got really angry because they needed to stop. After they did, they made their way to Rennick Reptiles. Now, Brandon tells this version of what happened next. He explained that when they arrived in front of Rennick Reptiles, Ben was outside taking out the trash. They didn't expect him to be outside, so they abandoned their plan and left the car without the gun. Linley actually introduced Ben to Michael, saying that Michael was one of her old friends who wanted to see some snakes. But Ben was a little confused because this was so spur of the moment. Still, he was nice enough to show Michael around. After that, they left, and that's when Linley and Michael got into an argument in his truck. She asked Michael to go kill Ben, and he was like, "No, I can't do it." He also said he didn't want her to be angry if she ended up regretting it, but Linley said she had made up her mind. That's when she put the gloves on, took the gun, and went back into Rennick Reptiles. That's when Linley told Brandon that Ben said, "What the hell are you doing?" And she shot Ben right in the face, and then multiple times in his back, according to Linley and according to Brandon's story. Michael just watched everything and then helped her clean up the shell casings, though he wasn't able to gather them all. Then, Michael drove them back to Columbia to the spa, and Linley showered and scrubbed all of the gunshot residue from her body. Ashley helped her clean up all of her clothes, and Michael got rid of the clothes in a dumpster somewhere. That was quite the story. After Brandon was done with his confession, the police were in shock. Brandon apologized for withholding this information, but said it was weighing on him. After his confession, all of his charges were dropped. He got what he wanted. He was let out of jail. I kept thinking, just like that, he's free? Anyone could just make up a story. Were they even fact-checking this? Remember the crime scene. Ben was lying on his stomach, facing the south wall. It was unlikely that Ben saw Linley come up behind him. What evidence was there that Linley had been the one to do it? Michael had been there the whole time and hadn't accused her. Detective Schaefer had to find out if Brandon's story had any truth behind it. But I was thinking, shouldn't you have done that first before letting this man out of jail? So he got a warrant to access Ben and Linley's private Facebook messages. This can take a while. I've heard it can even take years to get these. But he was scrolling through to see if there was any talk about the protein shake. Interestingly enough, there was a message where Ben asked if Linley had tried to kill him with the protein shake. So Brandon knew at least one detail of the story that the police didn't, and that seemed real. So was he telling the truth? I was thinking it's actually quite normal for someone to joke around and say, "What were you doing trying to kill me?" My mom used to say things like that when something tasted really bad. So I was kind of surprised by what happened next. Investigators told Sam and the rest of Ben's family they were making an arrest. On January 16th, 2020 at 12:01 p.m., Linley Rennick was arrested in Columbia on the charge of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. Michael Humphrey was found in Jefferson City at 6:45. P. Mand was arrested on the same charges. They conspired to kill Ben. But who had really pulled the trigger? They were held without bond for the first few days and then went to separate detention centers where Linley was held on $1 million bond. But the investigation wasn't over yet. Brandon's testimony was shaky at best. Police then talked to little Miss Ashley Shaw. Ashley did not show up with an attorney, and she talked about her job, her kids, and what was going on in her life without knowing that she could be charged as an accessory to murder. The officer showed Ashley the message between Ben and Linley, where Ben asked, "Did you try to kill me?" Ashley said, "What?" and claimed it was a joke. She explained that it was a brand new kind of shake. Linley and Ben both got sick, but it was just common food poisoning. Some of those wellness shakes are pretty nasty, but Schaefer did not believe her. At this point, he looked at Ashley and told her she could either be on the side of Missouri or the side of Linley. Team Linley was going to jail. That was a threat. It implied that if Ashley didn't confess, she was certainly going to jail. And I don't know about you, but if I heard that, I would get a lawyer right away. But Ashley just changed her story. She said Linley and Ben's marriage was heading for divorce, and a few months before Ben was killed, Linley told Ashley that Ben had inappropriately touched her in her sleep. Linley had woken up in the middle of the night, and please excuse me for saying this, but said that he was violating her with his hands, his fingers to be exact. Ashley said she was horrified by this information. She had been friends with Lyle for a long time, over a decade, and she couldn't imagine something like this happening. We won't know if it's really true. Linley definitely had reasons to make it look like Ben was a bad guy. Ben had allegedly apologized and said it would never happen again, but according to Ashley, Linley didn't trust him anymore. Linley said this wasn't the first time Ben had exhibited controlling and concerning behavior. But Ashley told them she'd never seen any evidence of bruises. She wanted to believe her friend about what was going on. And, of course, you're gonna side with your friend, you want to be there for them, and I get that. But that's when Ashley said that Linley asked her if she or her boyfriend had a gun. Ashley said she didn't, and asked what for. Linley said she wanted to kill Ben because she was scared that he would run off and get custody of the kids. Now this is sounding very similar to Brandon's story. Together, Ashley and Linley looked up how many prescription pills it would take for an overdose. Ashley asked her boyfriend if he knew anyone who had prescription painkillers, and her boyfriend got her 15 Percocet through a friend and gave them to Linley. That's when Linley made the deadly protein shake. She blended them up in a magic bullet at the spa and took them home to Ben. The next morning, Ashley got a text that said it didn't work. Then Linley called, and on the phone, she sounded frustrated. Of all things, Linley told Ashley she'd made her own unlaced protein shake and pretended she got sick when she drank it too so Ben wouldn't suspect anything. But somehow, he made it through the night. How heartless and cold would you have to be to do this? I just cannot even imagine thinking and saying these things to someone. Then Ashley went with Linley to her ex-boyfriend Michael's trailer, Michael Humphrey. Ashley drove, and their cover story was that Michael was installing a new speaker in Ashley's car. When they arrived, Linley asked Michael if he had access to a gun, and he said he did. She explained that her husband was abusive and that she tried to kill him. She wanted to know if he would consider coming with her to confront Ben at their house. She said Michael owed her for getting her addicted to painkillers back when they were together. Michael said he would think about it. Apparently, this was just supposed to be a threat towards Ben. Ashley told the police that Michael came back to the spa a few days later. The cover story this time was that Michael needed his car jumped, and a few estheticians at the spa were going to help him out. Linley, Ashley, and Michael talked in one of the spa rooms, and Linley confirmed that Michael would provide the gun. A few days later, on June 8th, again according to Ashley, she witnessed Michael pick Linley up from the spa. She had all three of their phones in her possession. She said she used Linley's phone and sent Ben a message that said, "Hey, I'm sick. I'm not feeling well and need to go lay down. Can you pick up the kids from school?" So that means Linley's text, which served as her alibi, was a text that Ashley had sent. I can't believe this whole story. But Ashley said Linley returned 2 hours later, took all of her clothes off, jumped in the shower, and then asked Ashley to scrub her body, her hands, everything. Then Michael showed up and asked Linley if Ashley knew what happened. Linley said, "Ashley doesn't know anything," and Michael nodded and left. Then Linley told Ashley that Michael had shot Ben. She also confessed that she was angry at Michael for having to stop and get gas before they went over there. They stopped at the Phillips 66 before leaving town, and Linley had paid for the gas. She was worried that they were going to get caught on surveillance video and that her alibi would be shattered. Days after that, Linley changed her story about what happened the day Ben was killed and who did it. She told Ashley that Michael got too nervous and that once we got there, I was fine to do it, and he handed me the gun, and I did it. So she had killed Ben. Ashley told the police Linley didn't seem sorry, but Ashley started feeling sorry for her. On June 19th, when the police found out that Linley was texting Michael Humphrey, Linley asked Ashley to text Michael and warn him that the police were coming to talk to him and that he needed to keep his mouth shut. Remember that thumbs up? I wonder if that really was an accidental text. A year later, Linley told Brandon the truth of what happened. Then Ashley, Michael, Linley, and Brandon all met up to get on the same page. So now this is really starting to seem like it's the truth. While this entire testimony was being used to corroborate Brandon's story, she'd been the one to tell Brandon about the protein shakes. So this really didn't tell us any new information other than Ashley being an accessory. But now she had full immunity for agreeing to help them and provide all of this information. Officer Schaefer then went through Linley's credit card history and was able to confirm that she had gotten gas from Phillips 66 around 3:45 p.m., about 40 minutes before he suspected Ben was killed. Even if Brandon and Ashley were exaggerating, all of these details were matching up. Sergeant Schaefer worked with Michael and Linley's prosecution to put a timeline together of all of Linley, Ben, and Michael's messages, as well as financial records. I'm not going to go into every little text in detail, but I will mention that Ben texted Linley in May, saying it felt like they weren't having sex anymore and he wasn't even sure if she was still interested in him. It really does. Then Linley texted him back and described him forcing himself on her in her sleep. He was caught off guard after that. Apparently he texted back, he apologized and promised to do better, and they discussed going to marriage counseling. So maybe that story was true. Then he asked if there was anyone getting between their marriage. Linley told him she still loved him, and there was no one else, but we know that's a lie. Both of them had made mistakes, but it seemed like one of them was after a more severe punishment. Michael's trial was held in October of 2021, and according to the prosecution, Michael had gone with the sole purpose of killing Ben for Linley. This was based on both Brandon and Ashley's testimony, his criminal history, as well as the fact that the 2 bullets shot on the floor had been done by someone taller than Linley, who was only 5 feet 3 inches, while Michael was over 6 feet tall. It was perfectly plausible that Linley told Michael he owed her and convinced him to bring the gun and kill Ben for her. Michael testified in his own defense, and sometimes that can go a little wild. He said that Linley had shown up at his trailer with Ashley, and he hadn't seen her in 6 years when she asked him to kill Ben. He thought she was joking. But remember, we've heard they planned for a week. During this time, Linley threw out the possibility that she would kill Ben, but didn't decide on it yet. Then on June 8th, Michael said he picked her up, and Linley told him she changed her mind about murdering Ben. She didn't want to do it anymore. She just wanted Michael to come there and support her emotionally because she was going to ask Ben for a divorce. Michael said he thought this was going to be a peaceful resolution. They stopped at Phillips 66. Linley paid for gas. They showed up and Ben was taking out the trash. Linley said Michael was a friend from high school who wanted to see the snakes. Ben hesitated, but he let them inside. Michael said he was looking at snakes, and then he heard a gunshot. He ducked and turned towards Linley, and she was at the end of the corridor holding a gun. He went out the door and got into his car, hearing the sound of more gunshots behind him. Then Linley ran out, freaking out. Michael said he didn't know where the gun came from, that it wasn't his. He was just there, and he wasn't the one to pick up the shell casings either. Well, I don't know who he thought the story was going to convince, because Ashley said Linley didn't have access to a gun, and Michael knew a lot of felons, people who owned guns, including himself. In late October, the verdict was reached. Michael was found guilty of first-degree murder and the charge of armed criminal action. His sentencing was scheduled for January 3, 2022. The police knew that Michael would most likely get life in prison without parole for killing Ben. They also knew that the person they suspected even more, Linley Rennick, was currently sitting at home on house arrest because her defense attorney, Catherine Berger, had somehow convinced the judge that, because of COVID, Linley needed to go home to take care of her kids and her dad, who had medical issues. Since Linley had no criminal history, the attorney wanted to know if it would be possible for her to be placed on electronic supervision, house arrest, until her trial. The judge actually agreed. So, the police and the prosecutor saw this as a bad sign for Linley's trial. They really didn't have enough concrete evidence against her for the jury to convict her. I watched these Zoom videos of her trying to convince the judge, and in those moments, I saw the power she had to manipulate. She interrupted her own lawyer, and the judge was stunned. He was like, "Wait a minute, do you want her to talk?" But the lawyer allowed it, and it was very telling to me.
And then, hang on just a second. All right, did somebody else?
I think my client was gonna say something.
Okay, Ms. Rennick, did you want to say something? Do you want her to say something?
That's fine, Your Honor.
I don't know if it makes a difference, but my home confinement would be at my dad's, and that is in Boone County. They're in Columbia. So I know you had mentioned that they had a service through the court that you would use. I don't know if that has any bearing on it, that I wouldn't be in Montgomery County on home confinement. I would be at my dad's in Columbia.
We understand that, Linley. I'm gonna talk to you about trying to pay for it. Okay, that's the issue right now.
Surprised to today because the insurance company also has concerns about her causing the death of her husband.
That is incorrect.
You don't want her to say anything, do you?
So they struck up a deal with Michael Humphrey. They told him that they could change his charge to second-degree murder, drop the armed criminal action charge entirely, and this would give him the option of life with parole. He would need to do a couple of things first. He would need to testify against his ex-girlfriend Linley in her upcoming trial. And second, he would need to tell them where the weapon was. If he were there, they said he knew who the gun belonged to and who shot it. If he took responsibility for the gun, he could still claim that Linley killed Ben, but had possibly used Michael's weapon to do it. Finally, Michael agreed to these terms. He waived his right to appeal his sentence. He was backed into a corner. So he told them the gun was his and that he knew where it was. It was kept in his current girlfriend's mom's attic, crawl space, underneath a big pile of insulation. The investigators got a warrant for the house where it was hidden. They went up to the attic, and sure enough, the gun was there. It was a .40 caliber Springfield, and they sent it off to the lab for testing, but it came back having no DNA that belonged to Linley. But remember, Michael had brought gloves to the crime scene. On January 3rd, 2022, Michael was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. He tried to appeal his sentence, but remember, he already waived his right and he's currently spending his days at Jefferson City Correction Center. But let's wrap everything up. At one of Linley's pretrial hearings, the prosecution came forward with the gun, and this was a shock. I watched this in the trial and I was like, wow, that was a bold move. They had the murder weapon. There was concrete evidence that Linley had participated in Ben's murder. Michael had no reason to be there on his own. They had conspired together. But it still wasn't clear who shot the handgun. Linley's trial was in Boone County, and it started in November of 2021. The prosecution attorneys, Kelly King and Nathan Kars, started their opening statements, saying that Linley shot and killed Ben, picked up her kids from school, and took them home, knowing that these kids were at risk of seeing their father in his last moments. They said that Linley used Michael Humphrey's gun, and that her motive was that she wanted Ben's life insurance. She needed it to keep the spa afloat. The defense consisted of Tim Heisman and Catherine Berger, and they tried to convince the jury that Linley was an open book. She cared about her kids and would never want bad. Linley brought Michael with her as a mediator because she was going to ask for a divorce. They said that she was outside Rennick Reptiles when she heard gunshots, and Michael ran outside. She was in denial and didn't know Michael killed Ben until she returned home that evening. What? That doesn't even make sense to me. You wouldn't go in and find out if someone just killed your husband after you hear gunshots. I'm not buying it. The prosecution brought several witnesses forward, including Ashley Shaw and Michael Humphrey, who told their stories. This time, Michael's story lined up perfectly with Ashley's. He claimed that he had provided the gun and that they planned to kill Ben the entire way to Rennick Reptiles, but he had decided not to at the last minute because he didn't want Linley to be mad at him. Brandon Blackwell also testified. He said that Linley lied to police to get him thrown in jail so that she could get custody of their child. Brandon was now taking care of his child, and Linley had filed a petition of defamation against him while she was on house arrest, but it didn't go anywhere. But the defense, when questioning Brandon, pointed out that Brandon's story was sketchy. First of all, he said that Linley pointed the gun at Ben while he was facing her, and from the evidence, that's not true. Also, the defense attorneys had talked to other people in Brandon's life to find out more about him in the protection order. This is interesting. In Linley's protection order, she said that Brandon had threatened to go to the police several times and tell them she had murdered Ben if she left him and took away their child. So Linley knew that leaving Brandon would result in him accusing her of Ben's murder. She was hoping that this was just an empty threat from Brandon, but the fact that he was threatening her and had controlling behavior meant she did not want him around the kids. But then, while listening to Brandon's calls from jail, as well as other conversations with other people in jail, he said things like, "I'm going to ruin Linley's life. I'm going to get out of jail and I'm going to burn that." So anything he had to say about Linley could not be 100% honest because it was tainted with revenge, which I kind of had a feeling. An esthetician from the spa, Rachel Hunt, was another witness for the prosecution. Rachel said that Linley had told her they were going to murder Ben with a gun before it happened. Rachel didn't call 911 because she didn't want to be a part of anything, and she had heard that Linley couldn't divorce Ben or he would take the kids. She said that on June 8th, all the estheticians were told to cancel their appointments. Michael came and picked up Linley, and Rachel and Ashley, who were roommates at the time, walked to the convenience store and the bank in order to establish an alibi. Then when Linley came back, Rachel was told to go into the break room, and she could not hear any of the conversations between Linley and Ashley. Rachel said that Ashley said Linley had blood on her clothing, but Rachel never actually saw Linley's clothes. Rachel also testified that the day after police got Ashley's testimony, Ashley had gone home and told Rachel that the police were going to ask Rachel for her story. Ashley said to tell the police everything. Now, I don't know if Rachel had discussed the details of the story with Ashley, but since they were roommates, I assume they did. Even Rachel's testimony may not be the most accurate version of events. I'm getting somewhere with this, but I want to tell you these things. Catherine, the babysitter, testified for the prosecution as well, and I found this fascinating. Linley texted to postpone their meeting up until between 5:45 and 6 p.m., but while Linley was still driving home before 6 p.m., she called Catherine to cancel the babysitting gig entirely over the phone. She said she couldn't reach Ben, so maybe Catherine shouldn't come. So Linley wanted to cancel the date plans for Wonder Woman with Ben before she even got home from picking up the kids. She knew that Ben had been shot, but did she know that Ben had died? Her story was starting to unravel when the defense attorney asked Catherine if she knew Linley well. Catherine said, yeah, she'd been babysitting the Rennicks for years. And when asked if Linley knew how to shoot a gun, Catherine also said yes. She told the jury that Linley had posted pictures on Facebook of her target practice, but the question was, did she know how to shoot using Michael's gun? That's when we finally get Linley's version of the story. Linley was no longer feeling safe in her own home after Ben's alleged forced actions, and she wanted a divorce. But according to her, she didn't think it would be safe to confront Ben on her own. He had gotten physical with her, according to her, allegedly on several occasions, including pushing her into the fridge and grabbing her arm. She came to work with bruises on her arm. She did everything in her power to make sure he wasn't angry at her. She would send him nude photos. She would apologize for the spa's financial problems, whatever it took. She never wanted to file a report against him because she loved him, and she would never kill him. In the weeks leading up to his death, she even had a moment where they both drank a bad protein shake and joked about it later. These are her words. She thought maybe everything was going to be okay, but she says he went back to his old ways. I can't help but feel like she's lying. After all, Ashley said she never saw bruises. There was never any report of this. But I have to tell you the story anyway. Linley apparently asked Ashley to come with her to ask Ben for a divorce. but Ashley's boyfriend told her not to go because he didn't want her to be in the same room with Ben. Not after everything he'd heard about Ben's violence. So Linley looked up her ex-boyfriend Michael because he was big, he was tall, and he was intimidating. She got his address off of court records and she asked Michael to come with her. She gathered up her personal belongings from the house and Michael agreed. It took a week of Linley going back and forth before she truly decided she wanted a divorce. Michael picked her up and she accidentally left her phone with Ashley at the front desk because that's where she usually kept it during the day. They drove to Reptiles, where Ben was taking out the trash. Linley said she was just working up the courage to ask him for the divorce. She introduced him to Michael as her friend from high school. Then she told Ben to give Michael a tour of the facility, and she took out the trash, dropped it in the dumpster, and then followed the two of them inside. It sounded at that point like the men were having an argument. She said, "I walked up right behind Michael, and then Michael turned around, and she saw a gun in his hand. Then she heard shots, screamed, and ran outside. She then heard more shots, and everything just went numb. She remembered staring at the trees. Remember that Michael Scarlett, Ben's neighbor, said he heard a woman scream sometime in the afternoon. Linley implied that was her screaming when Ben got shot, not later when she found his body. She says that Michael ran outside and pushed Linley into the truck. He threatened that he would kill her if she didn't keep quiet. So she disassociated and she said she was in complete shock. When she got back to the spa, she was in a delirious haze, and Linley didn't know at this point if Ben was alive or dead. She went into the shower to scrub off the memory from her body, wondering why Michael would even bring a gun. Then she texted Michael and hoped he had gotten home safe, asking him to come in the next day for another massage. That's when Ben wasn't answering her messages, so she was concerned. She was thinking, what if Ben was seriously hurt? Had he been hit by the gunshots? This story just sounds so fake. You wouldn't go check on your husband, but she was being pushed in the truck, remember? At this point, she said she canceled with the babysitter and prayed that her husband would still be alive. The next day, she said she talked to Michael and asked him, "Why did you do it?" Michael said he had a friend from jail who had committed homicide. Michael told her when he asked the felon how to stop someone from abusing their wife, he said, "Kill them." So Michael did. Linley wondered if he was high on meth that day. She was so upset she didn't plan to talk to him ever again. When prosecutors asked Linley why she lied so many times to investigators, she started to break down crying, which I have to say she's pretty good at. She can just let the tears flow on demand. She said she didn't want to be implicated in Ben's murder, and she thought it would look like she was conspiring to kill him. Really? You know, they say that the simplest explanation is usually the right one. It looks like she's conspiring to kill him. When asked if she knew deep down who killed him, she sobbed and said yes, and she apologized to Sam. Sam watched her entire performance and was sick to his stomach. He did not think this was a true apology. He thought she was a sociopath, trying to garner sympathy from the jury, putting on the waterworks with her innocent little deer in the headlights look. The defense painted the entire picture, and I have to hand it to them. They did an awesome job. I still had so many questions. Why would Ashley lie and say Linley didn't have bruises? She still cared about her friend. And if she really had bruises, it would have made more sense why she lied to investigators about the murder. Why would Michael leave his phone with Ashley and Linley if they weren't planning a murder? Even if Linley had not shot the gun, there were 4 different stories claiming that she had premeditated this, not once, but twice. If they did it as a plan, she would be guilty of whoever shot the gun. The jury deliberated for 12 hours, and Linley was found guilty in December of 2021 of second-degree murder and armed criminal action. The jury recommended that she receive life in prison. You may not believe how long she was sentenced, but maybe you will. 16 years. 13 for murder and 3 for armed criminal action, to be served consecutively. Then she'll go back to her life. The judge was frustrated by the sentencing because, in Missouri, judges are not allowed to change the jury's decision. He told Linley, "You're awfully lucky, ma'am. I just hope you don't kill again." Linley will be in the Correctional Center of Missouri until 2035, and I just checked my calendar, she'll be eligible for parole in 11 years. At the end of the day, I think it's some kind of combination of all of these stories. I do believe that Linley wanted to kill Ben for his money, and because she thought he was going to divorce her and be able to leave with the kids. She was cheating on him with the men that we know of, and using her poor husband to fund her spa project. She manipulated her ex, Michael Humphrey, into carrying out the murder for her. Based on the way the bullets hit Ben and the fact it was Michael's gun, I think Michael probably pulled the trigger, but Linley was the one with the motive, and she was there every step of the way. She's a really good liar, and she could put on the waterworks. I'm sure Ben wasn't a perfect person. We are all flawed. He lived his life wanting to make a legacy for the Rennick name and to provide for his children, spending as much time with snakes as possible, even taking in Linley's child as his own. Sam thinks if Ben would have known Linley was cheating, he would have ended things. He would have stuck up for himself, gotten a divorce, and gained custody of his kids. He would have been a millionaire, but all of that potential was ripped away from him, and it all boiled down to money and greed. Sam said that Linley's sentencing was an injustice. He doesn't feel his brother's life is just worth merely 16 years, not after everything the children and his family went through. Ben's death will haunt Sam forever, but the Rennick name lives on through the Rennick ghost, putting a picture on the screen, and through stories that captivate his creative, kind, generous, and loving personality. When life doesn't go as planned, a fresh start can often be the greatest gift it brings, a chance to regain hope and seize new opportunities, allowing you to begin anew and steer your life in a different direction. For many, this can be a beneficial experience. While there may be challenges ahead, we find solace in the knowledge that we have the power to shape our own lives and, to a large extent, determine our own destinies. It's truly empowering. But what happens when someone else takes control and takes everything away from us forever? For one woman, that's exactly what happened, and this is her story. I want to start today's story by introducing you to Norma Garcia. Norma was born to her parents, Tomas and Gloria, on November 16, 1960, in the town of Mercedes, Texas. Now, Mercedes is a tiny place in the far south of the state, just 8 miles from the Mexican border, and at the time, it was home to almost 11,000 people. Farming and agriculture played a huge role in the livelihood of many of the city's residents. It was known as the Queen City. Mercedes was a family-oriented community where around 75% of the residents owned their own homes. As you'd expect, due to its location, around 90% of the city's population was of Hispanic background. That included Norma's family. By today's standards, Norma was born into quite a large family, 8 children. I feel like families are having fewer and fewer children these days. Norma had 6 sisters and 1 brother, and she was right in the middle of the birth order. She was exceptionally close to her sisters, Oralia and Elia, and was more like a second mom to her nieces and nephews than an aunt. Norma had an introverted disposition. She was quieter than her siblings, always behaved, and never got into trouble. She was also known to be kind and compassionate, always there for her family. When Norma was around 12 years old, her family moved all the way to California, settling in the city of Oxnard in Ventura County. Her father, Tomas, made his living as a farm worker and was working as a union organizer for the United Farm Workers. He felt that Southern California offered his family a better life. This was a huge move for a girl from rural Texas. Oxnard was much bigger than Mercedes, with a population of around 200,000 people. But like Norma's hometown, it attracted a large portion of migrant workers, especially those in agriculture. It's known as the strawberry capital of California. The city's spectacular beaches, amazing California weather, and stunning ocean sunsets were definitely a sight to behold for young Norma as she settled into her new surroundings on the Pacific coast, just 60 miles northwest of Los Angeles. In 1975, when Norma was in middle school and just 14 years old, she met a fellow student, Teresa P., and the pair immediately became inseparable. They did all the typical teenage things together, always by each other's side. As Norma was coming into her own as a young woman and finding her feet, Teresa knew her to be somewhat of a feisty teenager. This balanced perfectly with Norma's sweet nature, which is what made her so likable among her peers. She was sweet, but she also wasn't a pushover. She wasn't afraid to show her inner strength as she gained confidence and entered her teen years. After graduating from high school in 1980, Norma enrolled in college but stayed in Oxnard, close to her family. It was there that she met a fellow student named Anthony Rodriguez, and the pair fell in love. After almost 2 years of dating, they got engaged and later married on March 6, 1982, when they were both only 21 years old. Norma looked radiant in her traditional floor-length, long-sleeve gown with an amazing tulle veil and her long, flowing black hair framing her face. Anthony also looked pretty dapper in his tuxedo, which featured a white jacket with black lapels and a ruffled shirt. The young couple beamed for the cameras, looking forward to a bright future together. Norma couldn't wait to start a family. This was something she had always dreamed of since she was young. Later that year, she gave birth to the couple's first child, a boy named Andrew. Then, around 1989, Norma and Anthony welcomed their second son, a brother for Andrew, whom they named Austin. I wonder if they stuck with the A names because of the father's name being Anthony. Now they had Anthony and sons Andrew and Austin. Norma's boys were her world. She would do anything for them. While Austin was still a baby, Norma knew it was important to do everything she could to give her sons the best start in life. So she decided to get a job as an assistant manager at the Oxnard Kmart store on the corner of Channel Islands Boulevard and Ventura Road. While working at Kmart, Norma quickly made a bunch of new friends with her co-workers, including one woman she became very close to, named Beatrice. When she wasn't working and running around after her sons, one of the things Norma loved to do was decorate her home for the many holidays throughout the year. She was known among her family as the first person to always have her decorations up. She was the one getting the tamale production line going in the kitchen at Christmas time, and she loved baking a strawberry jello pie. Sadly, by early 1991, the wheels started to fall off of Norma and Anthony's marriage. The couple started arguing more and more, and as Anthony spent less time at home, Norma felt like she was left to do everything for herself and the boys, which can definitely be overwhelming. According to Norma's childhood friend, Teresa, Anthony was also drinking alcohol more and more and getting physical towards both his wife and eldest son. Realizing that life as a single mom would be tough, Norma also felt like it would be less stressful than keeping herself and her children in an unsafe environment. 30-year-old Norma packed up her things and moved with her boys to a duplex on 135th East B Street in the city of Port Hueneme. Their new home wasn't far from Oxnard, only a 10-minute drive. It was in a quieter part of town, right near the beach. People called this area a hidden gem. It was affordable, had fewer tourists, and very low crime rates. Homicides were almost unheard of there. With around 22,000 people, the 5-mile-wide city had a small-town feel, where lots of blue-collar workers lived, and it was the perfect place for Norma to start fresh. The 50-acre Hueneme Beach Park was also a fantastic spot for Norma to spend hours with her boys, getting outside and making memories together. Anyone who has gone through a breakup, divorce, or separation knows you take comfort in anything positive. Their new home was the silver lining at the moment. The house on B Street even had its very own white picket fence outside, which Norma hoped was a sign of better things to come. Of course, she was grateful not to have to move too far away from her family, still having them close by for support. Norma was friendly enough with all her new neighbors, but she tended to keep to herself. Her focus was on her sons, making sure they were well cared for and ensuring they got a solid education so they could grow up to achieve their dreams. She was there at their t-ball games and school events, showing up for her children as the devoted mom that she was. Despite the struggles of being a single mom, Norma couldn't do enough for those around her. She was very generous, her generosity knew no bounds, and she had the biggest heart. She worked hard to provide for Andrew and Austin, even picking up extra shifts where she could. In early 1993, Norma joined her 6 sisters for a very special dinner at the Olive Garden. They were celebrating their sister Janie, who had recently given birth to a healthy set of twins. Norma had been so worried about her sister during the difficult pregnancy, so it was a huge cause for celebration. As a token, Janie gave each of her sisters a rose in Norma's favorite color, which was peach. As they parted ways at the end of the evening, the sisters promised to make these dinners an annual tradition. They were all so busy with their own lives that being able to get together, just sisters, was something to be treasured. And as something to take away from this case right away, it's that we should make time because we truly don't know how much time we have left with our loved ones. Now, as far as Norma's love life was concerned, in March 1993, the 32-year-old was dating a mechanic named Daniel Garcia. He was her 11-year-old son Andrew's little league coach. The couple had met at a party and began a relationship, and Norma quickly fell head over heels for Daniel. She had a great time hanging out with him, going out with him, and not only that, but he was fantastic with Andrew and Austin. Norma's friends could see that she was genuinely happy, happier than she had been in a very long time. She was then shattered when, around midday of that year, Daniel broke the news that he was going to be ending things between them. It was really heartbreaking, and it came as a big surprise to Norma since she thought everything was going so well for them. But Daniel admitted that he had decided to reunite with his ex-girlfriend, who had since reappeared in his life. That would be devastating, and Norma, of course, was very heartbroken. It's hard not to feel like you're just kind of the filling girlfriend until they find someone they really want to be with. But Norma picked herself up and dusted herself off once again, like she had done before. She had a great network of friends to lean on, and after all, her boys were her priority. Towards the end of the month, Norma decided to host a barbecue at her house on Saturday, May 29th, for Memorial Day weekend. Among the guests were her co-workers, including her friend Beatrice. The weather was just perfect, and Norma was looking forward to entertaining her circle of friends as they relaxed, kicked back, and had a few drinks while enjoying each other's company, like so many of us do on Memorial Day weekend. It would really help her take her mind off anything negative and just sort of let loose a little bit. The following day, on Sunday, May 30th, Norma had a chill day, just hanging out with her 4-year-old son Austin and watching TV together. Andrew wasn't there because he was spending the weekend with the boy's father, Anthony, in Oxnard, but he was expected to be home the very next evening, on Monday, since there was no school that day due to the holiday. So that Sunday night, around 10:30 p.m., a friend of Norma's called and asked her if she wanted to go to the beach the following afternoon. Norma said yes, because she thought it would be a fun activity to keep her busy, and of course, it would keep her mind off the breakup. Everything seemed so ordinary until the morning of Tuesday, June 1st, at 7:47 a.m., when a 911 call came in to the Port Hueneme Police Department. A frantic man was on the other line, telling them to send help. He had just found his ex-wife dead on the floor inside her home, and it looked as though she had been murdered. The man making this call was Norma's ex-husband, 33-year-old Anthony Rodriguez. Investigators, including lead detective Dennis Fitzgerald and Detective Anthony Paradis, rushed to the scene. This was Detective Paradis's first day on the job in a new town as a homicide detective. He had just moved up to the sleepy beach town from Los Angeles. All that the police knew from the call was that there was a report of a supposed homicide, but they were unsure of what they were going to find. But Detective Paradis knew the pressure was on. There actually hadn't been a murder in this town in over 3 years, so he was quite surprised when he got this call. When they arrived at the house, investigators found Anthony, his brother Hector, and his 2 young boys waiting for them outside. The investigators definitely were not prepared for what they were about to encounter inside that house. As soon as investigators walked in, they could see Norma lying face up on the ground in her living room next to a coffee table. She was fully dressed in a shirt and a pair of jean shorts, but what stood out was what was on her head. There was silver duct tape wrapped tightly around her entire head and face. The killer had used so much duct tape that it was almost like she had been wrapped like an Egyptian mummy. Some of the tape on her head appeared to be cut away, but not much of it. It was wrapped from the top of her forehead all the way down to the bottom of her chin. Dr. Praz thought this was very strange right away. He had never seen anything like this, or even heard of anything like this, in his entire career. They could tell that rigor mortis had already set in on the underneath section of Norma's body since she was lying face up, and that part of her body was lying on the hard ground. Because rigor mortis takes a few hours to set in, they were working backward to get a rough calculation of her time of death. It seemed as though Norma may have been murdered as recently as the early morning hours of that very morning, but there was still a possibility that she could have been killed before that. They couldn't be sure with just this preliminary examination of her condition at the time. Detectives suspected that Norma's killer may have also forced himself on her, given that her shorts were unzipped and unbuttoned. However, there was no way to know that until the autopsy was conducted. But it was obvious that this was a murder. They wondered, though, was she taken advantage of and then dressed again by the killer? Or maybe forced to get dressed with the killer holding a weapon at her? Or perhaps her killer was interrupted before he could violate her. They also wondered if the unbuttoning of Norma's shorts happened before or after she was killed, or was it maybe an attempt to stage the scene and throw off law enforcement? There were so many questions, and they described the initial scene as bizarre. Once Detective Fitzgerald saw the duct tape wrapped around her face, he theorized that she knew her killer, and they didn't want her to look at them, so they taped up her face. What was interesting was that there was no sign of a violent struggle or forced entry, and there was no blood at the crime scene. In fact, the scene was strangely ordinary, and in Detective Fitzgerald's words, it was pristine. Aside from Norma's body lying prone on the floor, nothing about the home suggested that a murder had occurred at all. The TV and the VCR were still there, so it didn't appear that anything had been stolen or that someone had even broken in with that intention. But that was just part of the house. They needed to look through all of the rooms. When they made their way to Norma's bedroom, the bed was made and the room was tidy. It didn't appear that anything had occurred in there. However, they were able to locate Norma's purse on a bedside table. It was open, but it didn't look like it had been rummaged through. In fact, her ID and her credit cards were still inside. For this reason, a burglary gone wrong was quickly eliminated as a possible motive. Now, onto the coffee table in the living room. Videotapes were scattered out of their cases alongside a pair of sunglasses, a remote control, a $10 bill, a pink hairbrush, and a decorative flower arrangement now on the floor just beneath the coffee table. In close proximity to Norma's body were her house slippers, along with a set of keys. In close proximity to Norma's body were her house slippers, along with a set of keys. These keys were confirmed to be her house keys, and Detective Fitzgerald thought they were in a very unusual location. Why would her house keys be on the floor like that, and not hanging on a hook near the door or set on a countertop? Due to the shocking nature of the crime and the infrequency of homicides in this area, this was immediately the type of case where all hands are on deck. Detective Fernando Estrella didn't think that this was an act of a stranger. Either he felt like Norma somehow knew her killer. By the time the crime scene technicians were getting to the end of processing the crime scene, Norma's sister, Auralia, pulled up to the house. The sisters had plans that morning to go car shopping, to pick something out for Norma. But when she hadn't answered any of Auralia's calls earlier that morning, she became concerned and drove over to Norma's house. When she saw the yellow crime scene tape and police, she was shocked. She introduced herself to the detectives, and they broke the devastating news. In her heart, Auralia felt like someone Norma knew had done this to her. Given that things were strained with Anthony, Norma's ex, Auralia wouldn't have put it past him to have something to do with this. Of course, we know that since Anthony is her ex, it was going to be a priority for detectives to speak with him. He was actually the one who called in and reported the murder, and he was the one who found Norma's body. Not only had he been there the evening before to drop Andrew back off, but he could have been the last person to see Norma alive, besides her children. Detectives took him, Hector, and the boys down to the police station to all be interviewed. Anthony appeared to be very overwhelmed with grief for all the problems that he and Norma had. Even though they were no longer together, the mother of his children was gone, and Anthony couldn't believe that someone could have targeted Norma in such a callous way. Down at the police department, Anthony gave detectives his account of how he and his brother Hector arrived at the house that morning and found Norma's body. He explained that, on the morning of June 1st, 11-year-old Andrew was back at home with his mom and his younger 4-year-old brother Austin. Around 7:30 a.m., 33-year-old Anthony came to the house to take Andrew to school that morning and Austin to daycare. This was part of the co-parenting routine since the time that Norma and Anthony split up. Anthony helped to shuttle the boys to school. With him that morning was his brother Hector, who waited outside in Anthony's truck, reading the paper and listening to the radio as Anthony went inside to retrieve the boys. Anthony said when he got to the front door, the house seemed strangely quiet. He expected Norma to answer the door when he knocked, like she always did, and he usually heard his sons playing or talking inside. But there was nothing. It was quiet, and he got no response even when he kept knocking. So, he got worried that something was wrong. He couldn't get inside because the door was locked, and Anthony did not have a key. He told detectives that he used a credit card to slide between the door frame and the lock and broke in to gain access, which is pretty interesting. So he did force himself into this home. Then Anthony explained that he walked through the door, called out to Norma, and didn't get an answer. He turned into the living room, and that's when he was confronted with the shocking sight of his ex-wife, dead on the ground. He didn't immediately understand what he was seeing. There, lying face up on the floor, was the lifeless body of 32-year-old Norma, her head wrapped in duct tape, the top of her denim shorts unbuttoned, her arms splayed out on either side of her body. Anthony said he was frantic. He rushed back to the truck to get his brother Hector, running back inside together. Now they were desperate to find Andrew and Austin. Anthony said that the boys had been asleep, but they woke up due to him pounding on the door in all the commotion. By the time Anthony and Hector went back inside, the boys had started to wander out into the living room, where they saw something that no child should ever have to see. They couldn't process why their mother's face was covered, and she wasn't waking up. But being older, Andrew definitely knew that something was terribly wrong. Anthony and Hector quickly told Andrew and Austin to go back in the room and stay there until they were told to come back out. Now Hector had to be interviewed next, and he explained that he was the one who cut through the duct tape. Remember how the investigators noticed that some of it was cut? Well, Hector explained that when he saw Norma like that, he bent down to see if she was still alive. In his opinion, he stated that he thought she was still warm, so he grabbed a pair of scissors from a first aid kit in the truck and attempted to cut the tape where her mouth and nose were so that she could breathe. But when she failed to take in a sudden sharp intake of breath, Hector said he knew she was dead. Now I will say that investigators did think it was odd that Hector removed the tape from Norma's face, therefore interfering with the scene, essentially destroying evidence and contaminating it with his DNA. When he mentioned her being warm, they knew that was not possible. Maybe he thought she felt warm, but the truth was her body was in rigor mortis. She was not warm. So this seemed a little suspicious. But on the other hand, if you see someone with something over their head covering their face, that's restricting their breathing. It's a natural human instinct to take steps to remove this obstruction. Detective Paradas thought it was a little suspicious, and so did the other investigators. Now, as the victim's estranged husband and his brother Hector, they needed to be eliminated before anyone else could be focused on. Anthony was known to be upset about the fact that Norma had already moved on and was dating Daniel, even though we know that Daniel had broken things off at this point. Plus, the boys were living with Norma most of the time. They wondered if Anthony had a motive, like gaining sole custody of the boys and maybe avoiding paying child support. It's certainly a motive for a lot of bitter ex-husbands in all sorts of scenarios. So of course, they confronted Anthony about it. He told the detectives that he and Norma had separated a few years previously, but they were not actually legally divorced. He regularly visited the boys, and he and Norma were civil in order to set a healthy and positive example for their sons. Now, Anthony stated that Andrew had spent the weekend with him from May 28th to the night of the 31st. He and Hector took Andrew to a Los Angeles Angels baseball game. Then, Anthony and Hector dropped Andrew back off at Norma's on the evening of May 31st around 8:45 p.m. But Anthony told investigators he didn't go inside the house. Hector told investigators that after the men dropped Andrew off, they drove back to his place in Oxnard, where they hung out with other relatives. This was corroborated by the people that they claimed they were with that night. Now, Anthony's take on the status of his relationship with Norma sounded all well and good, but Norma's family gave the police a very different account of the dynamic in their relationship, especially after they broke up. According to her sister Aurelia, Norma was uncomfortable with the frequency of Anthony's visits. While sometimes it's very difficult to get some fathers to even remain involved in their children's lives following the marriage breaking down, Anthony seemed like he was the opposite. But it caused conflict. He would show up unannounced at Norma's house, and then he would kind of stay to hang out. He would say that he was there for the boys, but then he would just want to kind of hang out with Norma. So Norma's sister said, "Don't let him into your house." That's the advice she gave her sister. If he wasn't scheduled to come there, don't let him inside. But Norma didn't always feel that she could stand up to him. Anthony still seemed like he wanted to be a big part of Norma's life. Not because he loved her per se, but because he wanted to control the situation. So the investigators wondered, was Anthony's grief all an act? Hanging out with your family isn't the strongest alibi. Hector and Anthony were asked to sit for polygraphs, and surprisingly, the results came back with no deception indicated. Police also knew by this stage that the timeline didn't really make sense for Anthony to be the killer. He'd had Andrew with him the entire weekend, and it was looking more and more likely that Norma had been murdered before Andrew actually made it back home that night. Plus, Anthony seemed genuinely deeply affected by Norma's murder, in a way that made detectives confident that he was not their guy. So they moved on for the time being, and interviewed Norma's friend, the one who invited her to the beach on Memorial Day. She told police that when she came over to pick Norma up at 2:30 that afternoon, there was no response when she knocked on the front door. She just assumed that Norma had changed her mind, so she left. This goes back to the timeline that the investigators are trying to piece together. They really needed to get the autopsy results back, and soon they were in. At Norma's autopsy, conducted on June 2nd, the medical examiner determined that the duct tape had been wrapped around her head approximately 14 times. When it was unwound, it was 20 feet long. It was just like taken off of a roll like that in one giant piece, and wrapped repeatedly around and around. There were also indications that skin cells had adhered to this tape. Hair and blood samples, as well as fingernail clippings, were taken and stored along with the duct tape. Now, despite the appearance of her clothing, Norma had not been sexually violated. Norma's eyes had signs of petechial hemorrhaging, and her tongue had cuts from her teeth clamping down during this attack. The cause of Norma's death was manual strangulation, not suffocation. Norma was dead before her killer wrapped the duct tape around her head, and it was of course ruled a homicide. It appeared that she'd been killed sometime between 10:30 p.m. on Sunday, May 30th, and 5 a.m. Monday, May 31st. What was so shocking about this was that it confirmed that little 4-year-old Austin had been in the house with his mother's body for at least 24 hours, which is completely horrifying. We're going to hear more about that soon, but at the very least, he must have been wondering all that time why his mommy wasn't waking up. It meant that he was possibly the only witness to what happened, and to me, this detail is especially heartbreaking. No one, let alone a young child, should ever have to see something so horrific being done to another person, let alone someone that they love. For all that time, Austin was totally alone and vulnerable, and for all investigators knew, he could have easily become a victim himself. They wondered, did Austin escape with his life because the killer didn't know that anyone else was in the house, or was he intentionally spared? These questions were added to a very long list of answers that detectives wanted to get to. While investigators hoped that the killer's DNA might have been left behind and would be present at Norma's autopsy, 30 years ago, DNA analysis techniques were nowhere near as sophisticated as they are today. If you've been here before, I usually don't do too many older cases past maybe the 90s, unless they're highly requested, because it's tough without the advances in technology. There's just not a lot to go on, so a lot of these cases remain unsolved until they are revisited years later. I've talked about what was available in the 90s and a few of the other cases that I've covered, but in this case, investigators couldn't use the physical evidence that they collected. There just wasn't enough for an adequate sample. So all the forensic evidence was preserved and safely stored, which always frustrates me, but that's just how it was back then. You'll recall I said at the start of today's video that homicides were rare in this location, so everyone was on high alert. Norma's loved ones, of course, were in a state of shock. They were utterly heartbroken that something like this could happen to someone so sweet and caring. Norma's childhood friend Teresa, who had only recently spoken to Norma, was in total disbelief, and Norma's sister Auralia likened Norma's loss to losing the use of your arm. It's part of you that would forever be numb, and that's how she felt. I don't think any of us are prepared to hear about someone suddenly passing, especially in such a horrific manner. Her poor children, that's all I could think about, especially with a 4-year-old. You're going to find out more about what he saw a little bit later, but now knowing that Norma's killer had wrapped the tape around her head post-mortem, detectives were sure she knew her attacker. Concealing someone's face is a way for the perpetrator to psychologically distance themselves from what they have done and their relationship to the victim. Since investigators were at such a loss, they turned to the children. Anthony gave consent for both Andrew and Austin to be interviewed to see if they could tell law enforcement anything that they saw or heard. Now, any interview is tough to conduct in cases like this, but interviewing a child is on a whole other level. It's a very delicate process. You don't want to re-traumatize them or make the situation harder, but investigators also had to weigh the fact that Norma's killer was still out there. Who knows if they were going to return and hurt her family? So they began with Andrew. The 11-year-old stated that on the night of May 31st, when his dad and his uncle dropped him off at home after the baseball game, they must not have waited. Andrew just walked up to the front door, and he would be let in quickly, like so many times before. But this time, as Andrew got closer to the house, he noticed how dark it was, and then he realized the front door was locked. Now, Norma usually left it unlocked if Andrew was coming home. So he knocked, but he got no answer. Knowing that it was late and dark outside, Andrew wanted to make sure he got into the house as quickly as he could, so he went around to the side where his bedroom window was located. He noticed that the window was open just a bit, just enough for him to crawl inside. He explained to detectives that he was surprised that his little 4-year-old brother Austin was still awake and playing on the floor in the dark with his toy cars. Of course, Andrew kind of asked, "What are you doing?" What Austin said is quite disturbing, knowing what we know. He said that he thought his mom was sick, telling Andrew that mommy has a band-aid on her face. He explained to detectives that he was surprised that his little 4-year-old brother Austin was still awake and playing on the floor in the dark with his toy cars. Of course, Andrew kind of asked, "What are you doing?" What Austin said is quite disturbing, knowing what we know. He said that he thought his mom was sick, telling Andrew that mommy has a band-aid on her face. Now, Andrew didn't really understand what his brother meant, and he also didn't give it much thought. I mean, he's 4. So Andrew assumed they'd just see their mom in the morning. It was bedtime, and he figured the reason she hadn't opened the door was that she was already asleep, probably asleep on the living room couch. She usually fell asleep watching TV in the living room. So, Andrew wasn't going to go out there and wake her up. Instead, he and his brother got in their bunk beds and went to sleep. Of course, we know that the band-aid was likely the duct tape wrapped around Norma's head, which is just chilling. I feel so bad for little Austin. What did he witness? The investigators were eager to find out. Austin's interview had to be conducted just as sensitively and appropriately, taking extra care to make sure they were going slowly and letting Austin ease into telling them what he remembered about his mommy that night. It was difficult for the young boy to get comfortable talking to strange grown-ups that he didn't know in a very unfamiliar environment, given that he was just a preschooler. The level of detail that he could provide was definitely limited, and there was still a lot of confusion about why his mom was gone. Explaining death to a child is very hard, but part of what's so disturbing about all of this is that while Andrew was out with his dad, Austin had been just a few feet away at the time their mother was murdered and had obviously seen her body to know that there was something on her face. I cannot imagine what must have been going through that poor child's mind, and even both of them when they woke up the next morning and realized that the person that they loved and trusted and depended on for everything was now lying lifeless on the floor. Surprisingly, 4-year-old Austin was able to provide quite a few details to Detective Ron Burns and a child psychologist who was there just to make sure that things went smoothly. Austin told them that his mommy had opened the door that night to a black man, and he said his name was Corey, and that man entered their home. I'm actually impressed. That is pretty detailed for such a young little boy. But that wasn't all. Austin said that his mommy and the man started yelling, and then the man wrapped the bandage around his mommy's head and pulled the zipper down on her shorts. Austin claimed he actually ran after the man, chasing him out of the house. The investigators wondered if he had just helped solve his own mother's murder. They needed to get on this right away and try to find out if Norma knew anyone named Corey. But there was an issue. On June 14th, 10 days later, Austin had a different account of what happened that night. Now he was saying that a white man came through the kitchen door and tied the tape around Norma's head. This man, Austin claimed, was named Warren, and he was with the black man. I feel so bad because I know that toddlers have these wild imaginations, and this was very confusing for detectives. Not just because Austin's stories were different, but there was nothing to indicate that Norma had been attacked by more than one person. I really don't know how they would know that in the moment, but this is just what was reported. They soon deduced that Austin's version of events were probably contaminated due to Norma's family. They had a very understandable desire to get information from this young boy, so they just kept asking him again and again about what happened, and this ultimately resulted in Austin being asked a barrage of questions. Even though they were well-meaning by their loved ones, it was really clouding and altering what this little boy was able to remember. Nevertheless, investigators had to follow up with the men whose names Austin had mentioned. What's even more surprising is that according to Norma's family, she did know two men, a black man named Corey and a white man named Warren. But I wanted to point out, this could mean nothing. It could just be people that she knew and that Austin knew, who came around or were friends with her, or some people that she met at her workplace. It didn't mean that either one of them were involved in her murder. We're talking about a 4-year-old. So it was quite interesting to be in the situation going off what a 4-year-old said as part of this major murder investigation. Norma's friends and family said she worked with a Warren and a Corey, and that she'd been getting kind of close to Warren recently, that they were good friends. Warren was actually a former co-worker of hers. His full name is Warren Mackey. He'd also just been at that Memorial Day barbecue at Norma's, and he didn't live too far away from her house either. It was about a 20-minute walk. They spent a lot of time hanging out, and Norma enjoyed their friendship. From all accounts, Warren had developed a little crush on Norma, asked her out multiple times. Norma told her sister, Frances, that Warren became quite pushy and started dropping by without actually being invited over, but Norma did not have any romantic feelings for Warren. However, she didn't want to turn him down and hurt his feelings. Norma felt bad for him because he also seemed to be struggling socially and was a bit of a loner. So, she didn't want to come off completely because she wanted to be kind, so she did her best to just be pleasant and not encourage any affection. However, she also wanted to include him in the group so he didn't feel rejected altogether. Now, some coworkers said that he was really nice, but others described him as a little odd. Now, when detectives spoke with Warren, he told them pretty much what Norma's family had said. He confirmed being present at the barbecue, and as everyone was gradually going home, it eventually was just Warren and Norma hanging out like they usually did. According to Warren, they just chilled and watched TV before he went home, leaving Norma on the couch in her living room around 10:30 p.m. that night. Then he said the following evening, May 30th, he, his roommate, and his roommate's girlfriend drove to Santa Barbara around 10:30 p.m. to go to a nightclub. When the club closed, the group left and made their way back to their place in Oxnard, leaving around 1:30 or 2 a.m. Warren admitted he was pretty drunk by that stage of the night and he just passed out. In terms of Warren's relationship with Norma, he told detectives that the two were close friends. They socialized a lot, but that was it. He did say, as a single mom, she would ask him to do odd jobs around the house, and he would do that for her, but he denied wanting anything more out of their friendship. But we kinda know that's not really the whole truth. However, when it came to his alibi, Warren's roommate and his girlfriend corroborated the account them driving to the nightclub in Santa Barbara on the night of May 30th, before coming back and staying in Oxnard. Meanwhile, the investigators got a hold of the other person that Austin mentioned, Corey Davis. Now, he currently worked with Norma at Kmart. He also came in for an interview. Investigators Darren Schindler and Detective Estrella spoke to him to see what he could tell them, not just about the night of the murder, but his relationship with Norma. Corey explained that he and Norma worked together, but beyond that, just interacting at work, he and Norma did not really socialize together in the same friend group. He also denied being at Norma's house the night of the slaying, saying he was at home with his mom and dad. Now, he couldn't offer much more than that, but Detective Estrella thought that Corey seemed on edge during the interview. I mean, wouldn't most of us be on edge if we were being considered a suspect in a murder case? But it just seemed like Corey was a bit more detached than, let's say, Warren was. And again, he didn't know Norma as well as Warren, so maybe he was just detached from the news of his coworker being found dead because he didn't know her as well. The thing was, he appeared to be kind of mad that he was even brought in for questioning. He was having difficulty maintaining eye contact with the investigators. However, they were kind of at a dead end. Nothing stood out in either one of these interviews with Warren or Corey, so they decided to speak to everyone that had worked with Norma, either currently or previously. Another one of her friends and co-workers, Beatrice, who attended the barbecue, told detectives that nothing seemed out of the ordinary on that afternoon, but she did remember that at one point Norma realized that her keys were missing. Now that's interesting because recall those keys were found near her body. While Beatrice said the guests at the barbecue were helping Norma turn the house upside down looking for her keys, but they seemed to have vanished. Now, by this time, police had Norma's keys, but if they went missing during the barbecue, had someone there stolen them and then possibly returned them later that night after letting themselves in and murdering Norma? This seems like a really big lead. It's the only one that they had. Well, investigators needed to look into every employee, and while the information from every one of Norma's co-workers was being gradually cross-checked, detectives came back to Corey because the address that he provided was actually different from his address where he lived. Now, it was only a small detail, but they figured if he was willing to be untruthful about something so small, could he possibly have lied about anything else? Or was it just an honest mistake? Maybe he was just nervous being at the police station, but they had to circle back. This time, when detectives spoke to Corey again, he was just as unhelpful and evasive as the first time. He once again denied knowing anything about what happened to Norma. He even told investigators that he did not want to be involved in this, and they understood that, but it was their job. Unfortunately for him, he was involved to the point of being someone that worked with this woman, and also that her child, who may have been the only witness, said was at the house. Corey was even more upset when investigators shared brutal details of Norma's murder with him. They wanted to gauge his reaction. I mean, that would be pretty disturbing. So investigators decided to have both Warren and Corey take a polygraph. Interestingly, both men passed. It seems like just another dead end, because as quickly as someone was being identified as a person of interest in this case, It seemed like one by one, they were turning out to be nothing. Nothing was tying them to the crime scene. But detectives hadn't finished making their way through the long list of people in Norma's life that they wanted to speak with, and one of those people was Norma's ex-boyfriend, Daniel Garcia. Remember him? The one that had just broken things off with Norma? Someone who wanted to rekindle things with a former flame didn't sound like the kind of person intent on harming Norma. But detectives soon learned that she and Daniel argued to the point where things escalated almost 12 months earlier. Daniel actually went into Kmart when Norma was working, and he instigated a heated confrontation in front of everyone. Now that's a red flag. So they brought him in for questioning. Daniel told law enforcement that there were never any problems between him and Norma, even though he'd ended the romantic relationship. "We were friends," he claimed, "and I occasionally even went over there to visit her." He admitted to going into Norma's work one time, but he denied getting into an argument. When it came to Daniel's movements on the night of May 31st, he claimed he was at home with his family, watching TV before going to bed. Like the other alibis in this case, Daniel's relatives corroborated his account, but we know that this is not that reliable. So, you probably know what's coming next. Daniel sat for a polygraph. What do you think the results were? He passed, just like all the other men. It really seemed to detectives that they could not catch a break. Anytime a new potential suspect was identified, they were eliminated just as quickly. The fact that everyone the investigators spoke with was cooperative was encouraging, but on the other hand, it didn't leave them with any solid suspects to pursue based on any post-offense behavior. Everyone came up clean. This, of course, is the daily grind of police work, but the lack of meaningful leads was frustrating, and the people suffering the most in all this were Norma's grieving family. They just wanted answers, and despite the methodical and thorough work of the investigators, the lack of a breakthrough was demoralizing. The thought that a woman could be attacked in her own home with her young child just feet away terrified them beyond measure. While Norma's killer was walking the streets, her family would not feel safe, with her sister Janie telling the LA Times, "I don't want this to happen to anyone else, not to another mother, sister, or daughter." Norma's sisters were in the process of coming together and printing flyers to plaster them everywhere throughout the city and beyond. They wanted them to say, "Do you know who murdered my sister, Norma?" By now, Norma's shattered family and large circle of close friends had also said their farewells at her funeral. She was laid to rest in Santa Clara Cemetery in Oxnard. A month had now passed since Norma's murder. Despite the polygraph results, police had a very short list of 5 potential suspects that they were keeping to themselves. In the first week of the investigation alone, they collectively clocked over 100 hours of overtime. But the community was just getting a very real sense that perhaps this case was going to go cold and remain unsolved. Then, just as the detectives felt like they were really hitting a wall, they received new and surprising information about someone they had already spoken with. Norma's co-worker and good friend, Beatrice. Yep, remember? These two women were close, very close. So close that apparently, according to people that knew them, Beatrice had confided in Norma that she was having an affair, sneaking behind her husband's back with another man. Norma agreed not only to keep her secret, but to actually allow Beatrice to use her home to meet up with this new man she was cheating with. She even gave Beatrice a key to her house. Investigators wanted to know why she hadn't let them know this, and I think we can guess why. Why she wasn't exactly forthcoming with this information. Obviously, she didn't want anyone to find out about her escapades, least of all her husband, who also knew Norma. So deciding to do the right thing, she came clean to the investigators. Beatrice told them everything about the man she was involved with. This included details of when and how many times she went over to Norma's for their dates. But another possibility came to mind for detectives. What if Beatrice's husband knew his wife was being unfaithful, and he wanted to punish Norma for her role in facilitating this deception? I mean, that could be a motive, but when they brought him in, it was shocking to him. He had no idea his wife was sneaking around behind his back. He was absolutely heartbroken, especially to find out this way. But he had an alibi for the night of the murder too. He was at work. Detectives were able to follow up on this and confirm the validity of his alibi, which removed him from their list of suspects. Another person questioned during the investigation was the man Beatrice was having an affair with. Detectives looked into his whereabouts on the night of the murder and found out that he too had a solid alibi. As a result, he was also cleared of suspicion in the murder, another dead end. Norma's murder seemed to set off a horrifying chain of events in Port Wemy during the summer of 1993. The community was stunned by the brutal killing of Norma, and it seemed like everyone was already on edge. People were locking their doors and their windows at night and avoiding going out alone. But then, just 26 days after Norma was killed, yet another woman turned up dead. This time, it was an 87-year-old woman named Beatrice Ellis. Now this is a different Beatrice, not Norma's close friend. The victim was deaf and mute, and she used a walker for mobility. She was frail, incredibly vulnerable, and she didn't stand a chance against her killer, not being able to even call out for help. She was viciously attacked. She was stabbed in her bed in her third-floor apartment in a senior living facility just blocks away from Norma's house. Detectives were still trying to wrap their minds around Norma's murder when Beatrice's gruesome murder occurred. Before they could solve either one of these cases, tragedy struck again. Another woman brutally killed just 5.5 weeks later. The community was sent into panic mode once again. It was in the early morning hours of August 5th that 44-year-old customer relations manager Cynthia Berger, a resident of Port Wemy, was found face down and deceased in her bathtub by firefighters. She had been sexually violated and strangled, and the cause of death was determined to be smoke inhalation after a fire was set to apparently cover up this crime. As news of these heinous crimes spread, the residents of this community were left reeling and struggling to come to terms with what happened. These senseless, violent acts, one after the other. Nobody seemed safe anymore. Everyone felt like there was a serial killer on the loose. These additional cases increased the pressure on police. They had a relatively small police department of only 20 officers, the smallest in the county, and the police chief, John Hopkins, was actually doubling as the department's crime scene investigator. So it was no surprise that the morale in the police department took a real hit, especially the longer that these cases remained unsolved. It was putting a strain on the department financially and administratively. So, to do their best to help, Norma's family literally took to the streets in their campaign to find her killer, or maybe it would lead to killing these other two women. 15 of Norma's relatives conducted door knocks throughout Port Wemy and Oxnard. They were accompanied by Andrew and Austin, and they distributed 900 flyers bearing the words, "Someone murdered my mommy. Please help us." Wow, that would definitely get someone's attention. Norma's sister, Frances, told the LA Times she didn't want this case to be swept under the rug. She wanted the public to know that Norma was loved and that they were going to miss her so much, and they were going to try as hard as they could to catch her killer. She said that you never know what could turn up. Maybe somebody heard something. She didn't want another family to go through what they were going through. While it's true that some police departments may see Norma's family as encroaching upon their investigation, they didn't see it that way. Lead Detective Fernando Estrella welcomed these door knocks. He knew very well that some people felt really uncomfortable talking to police. They would much rather be open to a victim's family, especially when it came to giving them information that could unlock the key to find the killer. On the evening of July 31st, Norma's sisters held a candlelight walk in her honor. They started at the parking lot of Norma's former workplace, the Oxnard Kmart. The group that gathered to remember the slain woman walked the streets, finishing up at the home where Norma started her new life, the one where her life also came to a premature and brutal end. At this time, Andrew and Austin were being cared for by their father, Anthony, and their mother's family, including their grandparents, Tomas and Gloria, and their aunt, Alia. It actually broke her heart to hear her nephews call her Mommy. She actually had to remind them that while she of course loved them with all of her heart and soul, and she would never abandon them, she was their aunt, and that their mommy was in heaven. As the weeks turned into months, the police were still no closer to finding Norma's killer, despite having interviewed over 50 people at this point. They feared that this case was going to come to a halt. In an effort to help local law enforcement solve the 3 homicide cases, including Norma's, an FBI behavioral analyst came from Quantico, and in early September, they joined the Ventura County DA's office. Now, these detectives were working 7 days a week, so they were grateful for the additional support. After receiving the reports and examining the crime scene photos, the profile of the man that the FBI analysts believed had killed Norma was very much along the lines of what the suspicions were of the detectives from the beginning. They believed Norma's killer not only knew her, but knew her very well. Wrapping that tape around her head was an act of depersonalization, so that Norma wouldn't be able to look at her killer. Now, while all this was going on, Norma's family was intent on regularly making contact with law enforcement to make sure that Norma's case wasn't forgotten. On the first-year anniversary of her murder, Norma's parents, Tomas and Gloria, her sisters, and even her sons passed out flyers, wore t-shirts, and put out posters to appeal for information. They did this right near the Kmart, where Norma used to work. After almost another 18 months, by November 1995, the former lead investigator in Norma's case, Detective Dennis Gerald, was working for the Ventura County District Attorney's Office. The investigative team was alerted to a man who was suspected of killing at least 5 women throughout the United States. They wondered if this new person of interest wasn't responsible for all 3 killings that were unsolved. He possibly could be the perpetrator of at least one. 33-year-old former Ventura resident, Glenn Edward Rogers, was known to be dangerous. He was already suspected in another murder in Los Angeles, which was strikingly similar to Cynthia Berger's killing that happened only 9 weeks after Norma's. Glenn had been arrested in Kentucky following a high-speed chase, and it wasn't long before he was linked to these 3 other murders across the country due to his history of strangling his victims and then leaving their bodies in a bathtub and setting fire to the crime scene. To add to the suspicion in the community, residents had been calling in with dozens of sightings of Glenn in the past month, even though none of these could be confirmed. While on its face it seemed like Glenn initially appeared to be a good prospect for a potential suspect, based on his movements around the time of the 3 unsolved cases, including Norma's, he was excluded for 2 reasons. 1, it wasn't possible for him to be in Ventura County, and 2, his blood type didn't match the DNA recovered from Cynthia's crime scene. So, of course this was disappointing, but at least it was one more potential suspect eliminated. Now, after Cynthia Berger was found dead, the killings abruptly stopped. Years went by and these 3 cases remained unsolved. They all went cold, including Norma's. But 7 years later, after Norma's murder, in 2000, the Ventura County DA's office reopened her case. Now the Port team of investigators was invited to discuss cold cases and get input from various agencies. In the years since Norma's killing, there had been advances in DNA technology. It had come a long way, and this meant retesting that physical evidence might offer some new clues. Now, almost a decade later, in May of 2002, Sergeant Ken Doe had Norma's fingernail clippings and the duct tape covering her face sent off for testing by forensic scientist Shannon Barros at the county sheriff's crime lab. But whoever had killed Norma wasn't actually listed in CODIS. They ran the DNA through it, but there were no matches. So, in consultation with Ventura County Deputy District Attorney Richard Simon, Detectives Paradas and Estella, and Sergeant Ted SNY, they contacted everyone who had been interviewed as part of the original investigation and obtained DNA samples for comparison. Now, this was a very intense and grueling job, but Detective Estella had Norma's picture on his desk. For the past 10 years from the beginning of this investigation, he had made a promise to her that he would find her killer, no matter what. He had tears in his eyes when I watched an interview with him. These detectives were giving it their all, and they were not giving up. The months passed. This was a time-consuming process. But then, on the 10-year anniversary of Norma's murder in 2003, something serendipitous happened that no one could have believed. The crime lab contacted Detective Estella with a bombshell piece of information. A DNA match had been identified from Norma's right-hand fingernails. Detective Estella couldn't even believe what he was hearing. This was the breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for all of these years. They were elated over Norma's killer being identified. Can any of you guess who it was? Because finally there was going to be justice. Her whole family had been living in a painful limbo this whole time. The Garcias had all personally held different theories as to who killed Norma, which was actually a source of conflict in their family, and it added to their anguish. As it turned out, law enforcement had actually interviewed the person who did this to Norma, all the way back when they made their initial investigation in the beginning, just following her murder. The man who had come up as contributing to the DNA found under Norma's fingernails was none other than her former coworker and close friend, 39-year-old Warren Patrick Mackey. And he was suspicious from the start. Let me tell you about Warren. By the time the DNA results came in, Warren had been living a quiet life, totally under the radar. His entire time, he was getting away with murder. He'd actually been married for about 5 years, and he moved to Ventura, even though by this time, he was actually estranged from his most recent family. Nobody knew that Warren had committed this brutal murder and managed to get away with it for so long. Warren was born on October 3, 1963, in Santee, California. He had no criminal history, which was part of the reason why his DNA wasn't found in CODIS during the investigation and probably why they didn't suspect he had anything to do with this crime. Warren actually grew up on the East Coast in Syracuse, New York. He was the youngest child in his family of 3 older sisters. Sadly, Warren's mother had issues with alcohol abuse and did things like regularly making her children get up to clean the house in the middle of the night. Kind of odd. As a teen, Warren himself drank heavily and used drugs. As a young man, he moved back to California and in with his father in Port Hume, which is why he was living there. But soon, he was kicked out for not following his dad's rules. Warren went from low-paying job to low-paying job, living in rented rooms. Then, by 1990, the 26-year-old started working at Oxnard Kmart, and that is where he connected with Norma. At one point in the next couple of years, Warren lost his job at Kmart and lost touch with his friends, including Norma. But in February of 1993, just 3 months before Norma's murder, she and Warren resumed contact. I can't tell you why, but they did. By 2003, Warren had stopped using drugs and alcohol and was studying to become a drug and alcohol counselor. Kind of ironic. He was no longer working due to a condition that caused him to develop uncontrollable muscle spasms, and he was currently on disability. But he was still living his life. He had taken up a new hobby, camping, and he had a good circle of friends who all found him to be easygoing and pleasant. It was now clear that Warren had not only managed to outsmart the initial polygraph, but he also lied about his version of events on the night of the murder. The fact that he was the only one of Norma's large circle of friends who didn't attend her funeral always gave investigators pause. The excuse that Warren gave to their friends for not attending was that he knew police would be in attendance and he didn't want to be picked up on an outstanding traffic warrant, which, of course, was a complete lie. That would definitely put some red flags up. Warren's DNA being found underneath Norma's fingernails was compelling, but the detectives knew they needed something else to shore up their case forensically. If Warren claimed his DNA was under Norma's fingernails because maybe she innocently touched him, or maybe he could even claim that they'd been intimate together, this would be enough to create reasonable doubt in the minds of a jury. After all, Norma's friends had made it seem like Norma cared about making Warren feel included, and she didn't want to let him down too hard. So perhaps a jury may believe that their relationship had progressed. The investigators went back and looked over all the information that he gave in their initial interview, and something stood out. Remember how Warren claimed that he would go out of his way to help Norma with odd jobs around her house? Well, he had given an example. He said that the boys had a basketball hoop and then it broke, so Warren fixed it with duct tape. Yeah, going back, this was the only person that they interviewed who mentioned using duct tape or even being in possession of duct tape. And now, with the DNA results, it seemed like this was more than a mere coincidence. Investigators wanted to see if Warren's DNA was somewhere that would be difficult to explain away, like the duct tape. So in August, forensic scientist Edwin Jones ran Warren's DNA sample against the duct tape, focusing on the sections of the tape at the beginning and the end, which Norma's killer would have most likely had direct contact with. But even more so if they had ripped the ends with their teeth, which is a common practice when you're ripping duct tape off of the roll. Well, as it turned out, Warren's DNA was on both ends of the duct tape, proving there was no doubt that he used it on Norma. One investigator, F. Gerald, tried to replicate wrapping a length of tape around a mannequin's head to see if it was possible for Warren to have done this to Norma without leaving any DNA behind. He soon found there was no way he could have avoided some tape becoming stuck to himself through the process. If you've watched any trials recently, you'd probably know that probability ratios when it comes to DNA evidence can be very helpful in securing convictions, but the numbers can also be kind of confusing for a jury to understand. But the odds of the DNA under Norma's fingernails and embedded in the duct tape coming from somebody else and not Warren were 1 in 8,810 billion. So, I think that's kind of easy to understand. But they still knew that, in order to secure a conviction, they had to go back over the original case file and cover everything, fill in all the holes in Warren's story, and find out what really happened. Remember, Warren's alibi was that he went to a club in Santa Barbara the night of Norma's murder, and that was corroborated by friends. But they wondered, had Warren really been asleep for the rest of the night after arriving home at 2 a.m. like he claimed? On August 27, 2003, Detectives Fitzgerald and Denny Thompson got Warren back in for another interview to see if he would incriminate himself. It was just a last attempt for Warren to come clean if he wanted to. Detective His Told even showed Warren the DNA results, but Warren denied ever seeing or using any duct tape at Norma's house and completely rejected what police were putting in front of him.
I don't know what you're talking about. It's not only underneath her fingernail. It's on the duct tape. It's on the duct tape, Warren. I didn't have anything to do with this murder. Not at all.
He remained cool, calm, and collected. However, he couldn't explain why his DNA would have been underneath Norma's fingernails or on the duct tape that was wrapped around her head. Soon, Warren decided he didn't want to answer any questions, and he invoked his right to remain silent.
If you're accusing me, then I'm not going to talk anymore. And, I'll get a lawyer because you're accusing me now. Absolutely.
Absolutely, this didn't stop law enforcement from arresting Warren, who was charged with first-degree murder and facing a possible sentence of 25 years to life in prison. This was especially true for Norma's two sons, Andrew and Austin, who were now 21 and 14 years old. The family stayed tight-lipped following the news of the arrest, but after Warren's appearance in court on August 29th, Norma's sister, Gloria, spoke on behalf of the Garcia family outside the court. She said that they wanted to thank God for giving them strength to get through these last painful 10 years. Can you even imagine? Norma's family still knew there was a long road ahead of them for Warren's trial. After a delay of several weeks to allow Warren's attorney to review his case, he pleaded not guilty on September 18th. Outside the courtroom, Norma's sister, Frances, made a statement, and she said that she prayed for years that technology would catch up with whoever did this, and it looks like it finally happened. She said she didn't understand what went through the mind of a person who does something like this in reaction to rejection by killing a woman. She said it was such a waste. So many people were hurt. Her two children will never fully get over it. And what was the motive? Well, that was suspected rejection. Even though I've explained a lot of the details in Norma's story already up until now, the public had no idea of the specifics of this case. They knew Warren had been arrested because his DNA was at the scene, and they also knew that they had previously worked together, but that was about it. They hadn't heard of any of the romantic intentions on his part. Well, at Warren's preliminary hearing on March 2, 2004, several prosecution witnesses testified, including Anthony's brother Hector and Norma's older son Andrew. The prosecution was still considering whether to pursue charges of first-degree or second-degree murder. They still weren't certain they could prove a level of premeditation, and the defense was clinging to its own theory that Warren's DNA was under Norma's fingernails and on the duct tape for an innocent reason. I guess they could say something like, well, he was fixing things around the house like he said, or, They did have a consensual relationship of some kind, but there was no evidence that she had any sexual relations. So that was interesting. Like, where are you going to go with this? But almost a year later, on January 10th, 2005, while awaiting trial, Warren changed his mind. He decided to change his plea to guilty of second-degree murder. Unfortunately for Norma's family, Warren never gave an explanation as to why he brutally and callously took Norma's life. According to him, he claimed he couldn't remember the details of that night in question due to being under the influence of drugs and alcohol. Even if Warren was receiving a lighter sentence, he was still facing up to life in prison. But what it meant for him to get second-degree murder is that he would potentially be eligible for parole much sooner if he was ever granted parole. And that's something that no one wants to hear. On March 28, 2005, at Warren's sentencing, the prosecutor set out their theory of the case, and this is what I'm sure you wanted to hear, the details of what they think happened. They believe that on the afternoon of May 29th, Warren possibly stole Norma's keys during her Memorial Day barbecue, which Warren attended as a guest. Because he couldn't get over the continual rejection that Norma kept turning him down, he came up with a plan. The following night, on May 30th, he drove up to Santa Barbara with his roommate and their girlfriend to go clubbing. After coming back home from the club in the early morning hours of May 31st, Warren then made his way to Norma's house, gaining entry by using her own keys and bringing duct tape with him. Warren most likely found Norma asleep on the living room couch because it wasn't unusual for her to doze off while watching TV. The prosecutor said that he might have made a last-ditch effort to see if Norma would get romantically involved with him or have sex with him, or maybe he already had murder on his mind. Maybe his plan could have been to violate her, and that's why her zipper was down. Maybe he was going to make her pay for rejecting him one too many times. But of course, it's difficult to speculate what the motive was. It's not 100% certain. What's clear, though, is that when Andrew was at his father's for that weekend, Austin was in his bedroom just feet away or even watching from a distance. Warren attacked Norma, taking her by surprise. After strangling her to death with his hands, Warren then wrapped duct tape around and around Norma's head before leaving and returning to his house like nothing happened. Poor little Austin was left in that house with his mother's dead body for at least 24 hours. Austin told Andrew, as best he could, the following night what had happened, but he didn't understand what really went on, other than knowing that his mom was maybe sick and that she had a Band-Aid on her face, which is just heartbreaking to hear. It was only on the morning of June 1st, when Anthony came to pick up the boys, that anyone realized the true horror of what occurred. The prosecutor said that this was a senseless and terrible crime, and although Warren pleaded guilty, he still had not come clean. The family felt so frustrated because of that. There were so many questions. Then Norma's loved ones delivered their victim impact statements. Their rage and their anguish could be felt throughout that courtroom. Norma's mother spoke through a Spanish interpreter and held a photograph of her daughter along with one of the original flyers. She said through tears, "I want to know why he did this. I want him to see that he caused this great pain. I feel like I have been stabbed every time he wakes up. When he looks at those hands, he should remember that with those hands he killed, he destroyed life. Every time I see her children, they remind me of their mother." Norma's sister, Alia, cursed Warren. She explained that it was as though he murdered all of the family, not just her sister. When it came to Warren's turn to address the court and Norma's family, all he said was, "I sit here with a deep sense of sadness and remorse. I took a mother, sister, niece, and friend. You deserve an apology. I am truly sorry." Yeah, well, I think he's a sorry excuse for a human being. There's nothing human about this man at all, or what he did to Norma. At this point, Judge Curtis sentenced 41-year-old Warren to 15 years to life in prison. Outside court, 22-year-old Andrew spoke of his relief that justice had finally been served for his mother. He told the public he was a little overwhelmed, and now they just had to keep an eye on each other because it was finally done, and he was relieved. Now, in August of 2012, Warren was actually eligible for parole but was denied for a further 10 years. Then in April 2022, he voluntarily waived his right to another hearing for a further 12 months. In August of the following year, he was again denied parole for another 5 years, and this will probably go on and on. Hopefully, he will continue to be denied. Now, in case you're wondering what happened to the 2 other unsolved cases which occurred in 9 weeks following Norma's, you'll be pleased to know that they were both solved, with the perpetrators now being behind bars. In 2003, 34-year-old former handyman Michael Schultz was convicted for Cynthia Berger's murder, and he was sent to death row. Then, in 2011, 35-year-old Ricardo Villa was convicted and sentenced to death for Beatrice Ellis's murder. 60-year-old Warren Mackey continues to reside at Valley State Prison in California. At the time of this recording, his next parole hearing is scheduled for August 2028. Let's hope his parole is denied. The fact that Warren was eventually brought to justice after so many years was incredibly rewarding for the investigative team, and it brought an overwhelming sense of relief to her family. They no longer had this feeling that they were looking over their shoulder, not knowing who took Norma's life, and they are going to continue to fight with everything they have to ensure that Warren is never released. But the real tragedy, of course, is that Norma's 2 sons had to grow up without their mother by their side, without her guiding them and loving them the way she would have if she were here today, all because she refused a man's advances. It's all too common for a woman to die at the hands of a rejected man. It's senseless. Andrew and Austin had their fair share of emotional struggles that they had to deal with. Austin has a tattoo on his arm of his mother's name and a crucifix, along with the words "in loving memory." It's clear that Norma's loved ones have continued to do an incredible job of keeping her memory alive, and I hope that I have done the same with this video. That way, no one will ever forget her, including her 2 boys.